The tide at Aldrington Basin had always been quiet, but on a spring evening in 1973, as a Dutch ship reversed through the narrow waterway, its propellers disturbed the settled silt below. From that black sediment, something rose, heavy, bound, and almost human. When the harbor light caught it, the illusion became certainty, a body resurfacing after weeks of stillness, a quiet English town about to confront the darkest reflection of its own troubled decade. April 19th, 1973. The last of the daylight hovered low over Shoreham Harbor, turning the water the color of pewter. A thin wind came off the channel and pushed through the alleyways of Hove, carrying with it the industrial scent of salt, oil, and steel. On the southern edge of Aldrington Basin, a man named John Amadio, a sign-maker by trade, took his evening walk as he had many times before. It was nearly Easter, and the streets had quieted for the long weekend. He paused by the railings, struck a match, and lit a cigarette. In front of him, the water shuddered gently under the slow churn of a Dutch cargo ship turning within the basin. Behind him, the muted hum of the town, the distant clatter of trains, a pub door closing, a few radios playing from open windows. It was the soundscape of an ordinary English evening. For John, it was meant to be a moment of calm, a small pause between the day's labor and the weekend's rest. But as the ship completed its turn, the ripples it cast began to move through the dark water, shifting the silt below. At first, he thought he saw a tire rolling upward from the depths. Then something pale caught the light. A hand, or what resembled one. The cigarette fell from his fingers. He ran. The call he made to police was brief and frantic. By the time constables arrived with a small patrol boat, the object had drifted toward the retaining wall. The men used a boat hook to snag the shoulder of a navy blue jacket and with effort pulled it to the surface. What they drew in was not merely heavy with water. Concrete blocks had been tied to the body with blue plastic bags and coarse rope, an improvised anchor meant to keep it hidden forever. The corpse was dragged onto the quay. Floodlights were brought in from the nearby depot, illuminating the scene with an industrial glare. The officers worked in near silence, disturbed only by the sound of boots against wet concrete and the low creak of the harbor chains. When they finally rolled the body onto the canvas sheet, one of them turned away and retched quietly behind a wall. The sight was not theatrical. It was the slow, stubborn horror of human remains exposed to the open air after too long underwater. Detective Chief Superintendent James Marshall was called from his nearly finished shift. He was a seasoned investigator, the kind of man who had seen enough of post-war England's private tragedies to move efficiently through shock. But even he paused when he arrived. The smell of brine and decay hung in the air, mingling with the diesel fumes from the moored ships. The basin, usually a quiet pocket between Brighton and Hove, now felt like a wound in the coastline. He ordered the area sealed. Canvas screens went up around the site, blocking the growing crowd that had gathered along the promenade. In the distance, children's laughter from an amusement arcade mixed eerily with the steady murmur of police radios. Britain, in that year, was a country split between optimism and exhaustion, between glam rock posters on cafe walls and headlines of strikes, unemployment, and violence. The contrasts of the decade pressed close together that night, neon and rot, youth and death, silence and noise. When the pathologist, Professor Hugh Johnson of St. Thomas's Hospital, arrived around 8 o'clock, the tide had receded slightly. Under the glare of floodlights, he began his preliminary examination. The face had been partly stripped by fish and current. The scalp was missing. The flesh that remained clung to the bone in patches, darkened by water and time. There were ropes around the wrists and ankles, coarse and frayed at the edges. Johnson noted that whoever had tied them had done so methodically. There was no sign of panic, only intention. He worked quietly, his voice low as he dictated observations into a recorder. The officers nearby heard only fragments. Male, young, approximate height 6 feet, clothing, denim, tattoo on forearm. The small procedural words carried a heavy finality. Somewhere beyond the basin, people were still eating their dinners, unaware that an anonymous boy's story had just begun to resurface. The victim's pockets yielded a few fragments of a life. A soaked paperback copy of The Maricot Deep by Arthur Conan Doyle, a novel about an underwater city, coincidence pressing cruelly against reality, and 2 folded sheets of paper sealed together by dampness. Loose change, decimal coins, indicated a recent death. The system had changed only 2 years earlier. When the body was transported to the mortuary in Hove, the rain began. A thin, cold drizzle that softened the air and muted the sound of boots on pavement. Inside the examination room, Johnson continued under brighter light. He noted the absence of any blunt trauma to the skull, no visible ligature marks, and no internal injuries suggesting stabbing or strangulation. The lungs, however, told the story. Microscopic algae from the basin's own waters were embedded in the tissue. The young man had drowned right there, in that harbor, not elsewhere. The detail transformed the crime. It was no longer a dumping at sea, it was a killing bound to place, an act committed and concluded within the same waters that sustained the town's industry. Detective Marshall watched as Johnson peeled back a section of the jacket sleeve. Beneath the fabric, faint letters appeared on the forearm tattoo, obscured by decomposition. The skin was rubbed clean carefully until they were clear enough to read HAC. Above them, a heart pierced by an arrow. To anyone else, it might have meant nothing. To Marshall, it was the first whisper of a world beneath the surface. Initials, codes, affiliations that lived within the subcultures, growing in the margins of Britain's youth. Outside, the rain strengthened. The police cordon reflected light like a string of wet glass. Reporters were beginning to arrive, their questions hushed but insistent. The detective gave no statements. Not yet. Not until the boy had a name. Within the mortuary, Johnson made one last note before removing his gloves. The body, though decomposed, showed signs of youth. Smooth joints, unweathered bone, teeth not yet fully matured. He estimated the age at 18, possibly younger. When the room fell silent again, the only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lamp above the table and the faint tap of rain against the window. The sea was only a few hundred yards away, yet its presence filled every space. The salt, the damp, the unseen current beneath everything. It would take days before a palm print would match to a name, and weeks before the full truth of that night would emerge. For now, the investigators could only look at the evidence, the concrete, the rope, the tattoos, and imagine what kind of life had ended with such quiet finality. In that moment, under the cold hospital light, the young man was not yet a victim or a headline. He was an unnamed figure from Britain's restless generation, one among thousands shaped by economic despair, cultural upheaval, and the aching need to belong. His story, like so many of that time, had surfaced only after it was too late. Outside, as the floodlights were turned off and the harbor fell back into darkness, the water returned to stillness. The ripples subsided. The basin once again looked empty. But the illusion of peace had already been broken. By dawn the next morning, the basin was almost calm again. The ships that had moored overnight were outlined in gray against the first pale light of day, and the faint gull cries broke through the quiet. The surface of the water, slick and opaque, gave no hint of what it had surrendered only hours before. To the casual passerby, the harbor looked unchanged. Yet beneath its stillness lingered an unease that could not be washed away with the tide. Detective Chief Superintendent James Marshall arrived just after sunrise. The smell of salt and iron hung thick in the damp air. He had slept little, if at all. The discovery of the boy's body meant that the Sussex police would once again spend their holiday in pursuit of another ghost. The previous case, a young girl murdered while hitchhiking, had only just been closed. Marshall had hoped for a brief reprieve, but murder in Britain, even in small coastal towns, seldom followed a calendar. He stood at the edge of the quay, staring at the dark line where the sea met the sky. The place felt eerily domestic in daylight. Workers moving equipment, a fisherman scraping barnacles from his boat's hull, the steady thud of ropes being hauled in. It could have been any morning in post-war England, ordinary and worn. Yet within that ordinariness lay something irreparably broken. Inside the temporary incident room, set up in a converted shipping office, officers crowded around a table littered with wet notebooks and photographs. The black and white images showed the body as it had been found, arms bound, denim soaked, face half gone. There was no artistry to the violence, only a grim efficiency. Marshall's eyes lingered on the photograph of the tattoo. The letters HAC were clearly visible now, stark against pale skin. He thought of the subcultures he had come to recognize over the years, the restless youth who gathered in coffee bars and roadside cafes, imitating the American gangs they had seen in magazines, the Hells Angels, the skinheads, the small local offshoots that borrowed their imagery without the means to live it. These young men were not criminals in the organized sense, but outcasts drawn to borrowed power. Some wore leather because they could not afford steel. Others used violence as a language of belonging. Marshall had seen their kind before, not evil, but aimless. At 10 o'clock, Professor Hugh Johnson arrived with his report. His tone was clinical, his sentences measured. The victim, he said, had likely been in the water between 4 and 6 weeks. There was evidence of drowning, but no signs of struggle at the moment of submersion. This suggested unconsciousness prior to death. Johnson paused, then added that the concrete and rope were tied with deliberate skill, as though done by someone accustomed to handling heavy materials. The meeting room was quiet. A junior detective asked whether the bindings might indicate more than one perpetrator. Johnson nodded slightly. "It is possible," he said, "though unnecessary for the task itself. It may suggest collaboration or fear of failure." Marshall made a note. Collaboration. The word stayed with him. He had seen it before. In domestic murders, in crimes of impulse shared between people bound by loyalty or delusion. In his experience, cruelty was rarely solitary. It required witnesses to justify itself. By midday, the Fingerprints Division had sent an update. The boy's fingers were too damaged to yield prints, but a partial palm pattern had been preserved. It was faint, but usable. The sample was sent to the Sussex Bureau for comparison. Marshall ordered a check of missing persons across the county. In the early 1970s, record-keeping was inconsistent. Handwritten forms were often misplaced or misfiled. The bureaucratic slowness of post-war policing meant that families sometimes waited months for answers that could have been found in hours. Outside, rain returned, fine and persistent. It streaked down the windows, turning the industrial yard into a blurred composition of cranes and puddles. Through the mist, the detective could see a group of dock workers standing by the railings, smoking in silence. The harbor, once a symbol of livelihood, now felt like a reminder of decline. Britain's maritime towns had aged badly. Trade was shifting, factories closing, youth dispersing into uncertainty. Every harbor was a mirror of the nation, a place where what was discarded could quietly sink. By late afternoon, Marshall visited the mortuary once more. The body lay covered, tagged with a number rather than a name. He found himself speaking softly, though no one was there to hear him. The ritual of death demanded acknowledgement, even in anonymity. He studied the denim jacket again. A faded navy blue with imitation brass buttons, the kind sold in chain stores to working-class youth who wanted to look like soldiers or rockers. The Levi shirt beneath was torn at the seam, the jeans stiff with salt. A white belt with a metal buckle completed the uniform. It was not fashion, it was aspiration. The small details, he knew, could tell as much about a person as any witness statement. This boy had tried to belong somewhere, perhaps to someone. The rope that bound him suggested betrayal rather than random violence. The harbor, though vast, was a local's place. Too quiet, too exposed for strangers. Whoever had done this knew these waters. That evening, as the lights of Hove flickered across the surface of the basin, the detective dictated his preliminary findings. Male, estimated 16 to 18, likely local, cause of death, drowning, evidence of premeditation. Possible group involvement. Tattoo reading HAC may indicate association with local gang or organization. The last line lingered on his tongue. Local gang. It was a phrase he disliked. It carried connotations of exotic menace that belied the truth. These groups were rarely organized. They were clusters of disillusioned boys, drawn together by poverty, imitation, and boredom. England's youth in 1973 were not revolutionaries, but casualties of a system that no longer knew what to do with them. As Marshall closed his notebook, he thought of the case files stacked against the wall. Women strangled in alleyways, men drowned after pub fights, children lost to neglect. Each file told a fragment of the same story. A nation unmoored, struggling to define its morality in the shadow of post-war decline. Night came early. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and metallic. The harbor lamps flickered on, casting long, distorted reflections on the water. For the first time since the discovery, the tide was rising again, slowly covering the stains on the quay. Marshall walked to his car, his steps echoing against the wet concrete. Behind him, the police tape fluttered softly in the breeze. He paused at the edge of the basin and looked down. The water was still, deceptively gentle. Beneath its surface, he imagined the same currents that had once carried the boy's body upward. Indifferent, silent, unending. He knew the investigation would stretch into months, maybe longer. He also knew that what they uncovered would reveal more than a single act of violence. Every murder carried within it the outline of a society that allowed it to happen. In the distance, a foghorn sounded from the open sea, a low, mournful call that faded into the horizon. Marshall listened until it disappeared. Then he turned away from the water, the sound of his footsteps merging with the rhythmic hum of the harbor machinery that never truly slept. The next morning would bring a name, and with it the beginning of a story that was far larger than a single death. The morning the results came in, the sky over Sussex was the color of wet stone. The wind had picked up overnight, carrying salt through the narrow streets of Hove. Commuters hurried to buses, collars turned up, unaware that in a police station near the seafront, a team of detectives were gathered around a single sheet of paper that would give the drowned boy his name. The print match had arrived from the Sussex Fingerprint Bureau. It was partial, incomplete, but sufficient. A small section of a right palm, faint ridges, smudged and eroded, aligned precisely with a signature form kept at Hove Magistrates' Court. The signature belonged to a youth who had appeared there only months earlier. His name was Clive Edward Jeremy Olive, age 16. For a moment, silence filled the room. A name transformed the investigation. It shifted the case from abstraction to consequence, from science to sorrow. The dead boy was no longer an anonymous symbol of youth violence, but someone's son, someone's worry, someone's memory. Marshall took the report and stood by the window. Outside, the rain blurred the outlines of the passing cars. He had been in this position many times before, holding the paper that turned a mystery into a life. But the weight of youth always felt different. He knew what the name would unleash: the knock on the door, the mother's disbelief, the inevitable search for meaning in something that had none. He drove alone to Norfolk Terrace, a row of modest terraced houses not far from the seafront. The curtains were drawn in most windows. The town was still waking. When the door opened, a woman stood there in her dressing gown, her face lined with sleeplessness. Her name was Pauline Olive. The conversation that followed was short, factual, unbearably quiet. Marshall spoke in his even, professional tone, careful not to let pity distort his words. Pauline listened without interruption. When he showed her the clothing, the denim jacket, the white belt, the metal bracelet engraved with Ollie on one side and Julie on the other, she nodded once, her expression fixed. Then, as if some internal switch had been released, she turned away and began to weep silently against the doorframe. In the kitchen, the detective noted the details of the boy's disappearance. Pauline said she had last seen her son at 6 in the evening on February 28th. He had left home after dinner, promising to meet friends. When he didn't return that night, she had waited, assuming he was staying somewhere nearby. By the second day, she reported him missing. She spoke softly with an apologetic rhythm, as though she feared being judged for not having done more. Marshall looked around the small house. There were school photographs on the mantel, comic books stacked neatly on a shelf, a cat asleep on the sofa. It was the quiet domesticity of a working-class home, modest, clean, suspended between pride and fatigue. Pauline said Clive had been a good boy, a phrase repeated by every parent he had ever interviewed. But her voice cracked when she added, "He wasn't bad, not really, just lost." Back at the station, Marshall began to reconstruct the boy's final weeks. He had been working nights at a cafe called The Gondola, washing dishes, saving small change in a jar for something unspecified. He had left school the previous year, abandoned his O-levels, and spent his evenings with a loose group of teenagers known locally as the Mad Dogs. They were a kind of imitation motorcycle club, part Hells Angels, part Seaside delinquency. Few of them owned bikes. Most drifted between petty theft, long nights, and violent boredom. It was not unusual. Across Britain, youth culture had fractured into small tribes. Glam rock glittered on television while unemployment climbed beyond the imagination of the previous decade. Young men without work or direction sought identity in imitation. Leather jackets, slogans, and secret rituals. To outsiders, they looked dangerous. To themselves, they were merely trying to exist. Marshall ordered background checks on every known member of the Mad Dogs in the Brighton and Hove area. The reports that came back were thin: petty theft, public disturbance, possession of drugs. Nothing that suggested murder. Yet the tone of the descriptions troubled him. Words like unpredictable, aggressive, leaderless. These boys were not hardened criminals. They were volatile, impulsive, and loyal to one another in ways that defied reason. In the days that followed, interviews began. The cafe where Clive had worked was small, the kind of place that smelled perpetually of coffee and fried bread. Its owner described him as quiet, polite, a boy who kept to himself. Other employees recalled that he spent hours after closing, playing Jimi Hendrix on the jukebox, sometimes alone. To them, he was not dangerous, only restless. The same could not be said of the crowd he mixed with outside. Teenagers in patched denim and boots spoke of the Mad Dogs with a mixture of awe and fear. One girl said she had seen Clive with a black eye in early February. Another claimed he was trying to leave the group but was being harassed. These fragments formed a pattern. A boy trying to climb out of something he did not understand. Marshall studied Clive's photograph that evening. The image, taken the previous year, showed a lean face with cautious eyes. There was a hint of defiance in the tilt of his mouth, but not cruelty. He looked like thousands of others, a youth caught between childhood and a world that had no place for him. He thought of the tattoo again. HAC. At first, he assumed it might refer to a local chapter of the Hells Angels, but none matched those initials. Then a constable suggested it could stand for Hells Angel Cougars, a splinter group known in the Brighton area. It was a small connection, but one that rooted the boy's death in the subculture spreading along the South Coast. A culture that promised brotherhood and delivered fear. In his notebook, Marshall wrote, "Subculture as containment. Youth without structure gravitates toward ritual. Death may be social as much as personal." It was not an official observation, but a private one. The reflection of a man who had watched too many young lives disintegrate under the weight of the 1970s. At the same time, the investigation deepened. officers began mapping the network of friends and acquaintances. The name Julie Harmon surfaced, the same one engraved on the bracelet. She was 15, living nearby. Through her, detectives would soon learn that Clive's life had been far more chaotic than his mother imagined, that behind the quiet exterior was a pattern of risk, violence, and desire for recognition. For now, though, Marshall kept his focus on the broader picture. A teenage boy drawn into a gang he could not control had vanished for 6 weeks before resurfacing in a harbor weighted with concrete. Someone had gone to deliberate lengths to ensure he would never be found. The care with which the body had been bound suggested fear of discovery, not frenzy. This was not an accident or an impulsive fight. It was punishment. That night, the detective returned to the quay at Aldrington Basin. The floodlights were gone, replaced by the soft orange of sodium lamps reflecting on the tide. He stood at the edge, imagining the boy's final moments. The struggle, the silence, the water closing in. In his experience, drowning was the most indifferent of deaths. It did not rage or strike. It consumed quietly. He leaned on the rail, the salt air stinging his throat. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted from a passing car, a distorted guitar riff from a radio tuned to static. It sounded almost like the Hendrix tracks the boy had once loved. Marshall closed his eyes briefly. In his mind, the investigation had already expanded beyond the murder itself. It was no longer about who had killed Clive Olive, but what kind of country had made it possible. A Britain where the young carried despair like a birthright, and where even the sea, indifferent and cold, became a grave for the forgotten. The wind picked up, scattering a few scraps of paper across the quay. One landed near his feet, an old cafe receipt, damp and folded. He watched as it lifted again and drifted out toward the water, caught in the tide that never stopped moving. Tomorrow, he would meet the girl whose name was on the bracelet. The day after Clive Olive's name was confirmed, the investigation entered its second phase, the slow, methodical process of restoring meaning to a life that had ended without witness. To the public, he was now a headline, body in harbor identified as missing youth. To the detectives, he was evidence, a set of coordinates in a network of fear and violence that spread quietly through the seaside towns of Sussex. But to his mother, Pauline, he remained simply Clive, the boy who had once fallen asleep on the living room floor with his cat curled against his back. The formal identification took place at Hove Mortuary, beneath the humming lights and antiseptic smell. Pauline was led into the room by a young constable. She did not look at the body immediately. Instead, her gaze rested on the sheet, the curve of the shoulder beneath the fabric. Marshall, standing nearby, had witnessed hundreds of such moments, yet he never found them easier. The human mind, he had learned, resists recognition as long as possible. But the heart always knows. When she finally nodded, her composure broke. She pressed her hands to her face and murmured a phrase too soft for the officers to hear. One of them later recalled that she looked less like a woman in shock and more like someone quietly surrendering to something she had already suspected for weeks. Afterward, Marshall walked her to the car. She said little, except to ask whether they had caught anyone. He told her gently that they had not, that it might take time. She nodded again, eyes fixed on the rain sliding down the window. Before leaving, she turned to him and said, "He wasn't a bad lad. He just got lost." It was not a defense. It was a kind of benediction. Back in the station, the map on the wall was already filling with red pins. One for the Gondola Cafe, another for Norfolk Terrace, a third at Aldrington Basin. Around them, the smaller geography of Brighton's youth unfolded. Arcades, bus stops, nightclubs, the dim interiors of cafes where boys in denim jackets spoke in slang that adults pretended not to understand. It was the invisible world of those left behind by the post-war promise, where rebellion and despair shared the same rhythm. Marshall and his team began interviewing the people who had last seen Clive alive. The owner of the Gondola Cafe remembered him working the night shift, a quiet boy who kept mostly to himself but was polite and reliable. He often stayed after hours, playing records on the jukebox until closing time. Jimi Hendrix, The Who, an occasional Rolling Stones track. Music was one of the few constants in the uncertain lives of Britain's working-class youth. It offered not hope exactly, but volume, a way to make the silence bearable. One of Clive's former co-workers recalled seeing him with a group of rougher-looking teenagers a few weeks before he disappeared. They called themselves the Mad Dogs of Sussex, a name that carried both menace and ridicule. They were known to police, not as a formal gang, but as a chaotic fraternity bound by violence and imitation. Some rode motorbikes, others only dreamed of it. Their leather jackets bore hand-painted emblems copied from magazine photographs. They gathered in the underpasses and cafes of Brighton, adopting American biker rituals but stripped of their glamour. Marshall's notes described them as boys pretending to be men in a country pretending to be modern. They lived in the margins of prosperity, the sons of dock workers, cleaners, and machinists, growing up in homes where wages never stretched far enough, and the television offered only reminders of what they would never become. In such places, rebellion was not ideology, it was survival. Witnesses described Clive as both part of the group and apart from it. He was not a leader, nor entirely submissive. He joined in their rituals, their late-night wanderings, but there was something uncertain about him, a hesitancy, as though he knew he didn't belong. Yet belonging, even false belonging, was better than the quiet of being alone. When detectives searched Clive's small bedroom, they found a few paperbacks, science fiction, adventure stories, and a worn copy of The Maricot Deep, the same book found in his pocket. Its pages were swollen with water, but the words that survived told of men descending into the sea in search of a lost world. There was something almost cruelly poetic in that detail. Perhaps Clive had identified with those explorers, men seeking meaning in the depths, only to be consumed by them. In a drawer, they found a few notes from the Youth Employment Service. He had been offered an interview for a warehouse job in late February, but he never attended. There were no letters from friends, no photographs of girlfriends, nothing to suggest a social life beyond the gang. The only sentimental object was the bracelet, Ollie and Julie, etched in cheap metal, a simple token of affection, fragile enough to be forgotten, yet durable enough to outlast the boy who wore it. By the third day, detectives located Julie Harmon, the girl whose name was on the bracelet. She was 15, shy, with hair that fell across her face. She spoke softly, choosing her words with care. Yes, she had known Clive. They had gone out for a while, trips to the arcade, coffee at the gondola. He had given her the bracelet as a joke, calling it their engagement. They had fallen out later, she said, when he started spending more time with the Mad Dogs. He had changed, grown restless, unpredictable, sometimes cruel. She said he'd once boasted that he was joining a rival group, the Hells Angel Cougars. It made the others angry. Her description aligned with what little they already knew. The tattoo on his forearm, HAC, an emblem of shifting loyalties. Within those small coastal gangs, betrayal was often punished disproportionately. Violence wasn't just an act of anger. It was a performance, a way to maintain hierarchy when everything else was collapsing. After the interview, Marshall sat in his car for a long time. The sound of rain against the roof reminded him of the basin that night. The same steady rhythm, the same feeling of something hidden beneath the surface. He wondered if Clive's death had been impulsive or ritualized, if it had been about revenge or simply power. Perhaps, in the end, the reasons no longer mattered. In his years of work, he had learned that murder rarely began with hatred. It began with fear, of exposure, of weakness, of insignificance. That evening, he returned to the station and studied the photographs once more. The face, though partly destroyed, seemed strangely peaceful. The violence had already faded into abstraction. What remained was the tragedy of youth, the illusion of invincibility, the fatal attraction to belonging, the confusion between loyalty and love. The next steps were clear. They needed to locate members of both the Mad Dogs and the Hells Angel Cougars. Someone among them knew the truth. Someone had helped tie those ropes and carry those weights. The story was no longer only about one boy's death. It was about the quiet implosion of a generation left without purpose in a country that no longer recognized itself. Outside, the tide was turning again. The water moved soundlessly through the harbor's narrow mouth, carrying with it fragments of seaweed, oil, and memory. The surface reflected only the faint orange of the street lamps, a mirror too shallow to reveal what slept beneath. Before he was a case file, before the harbor, before the ropes and the silence, Clive Olive was simply a boy from Hove. He was born into the narrow comfort of a working-class neighborhood, a place where rows of terraced houses leaned into one another, as if for warmth against the sea wind. His father had left when he was 3 years old, the absence never quite closed, like a draft under a door. Pauline raised him alone, taking shifts at a local laundry, her hands perpetually raw from detergent. She called him her little gentleman, though there was little of gentility in their lives beyond the discipline of keeping things clean and orderly. Neighbors remembered Clive as quiet, polite, sometimes solitary. As a child, he loved animals, his cat, a guinea pig, stray dogs that wandered near the market. He had once told his mother that he wanted to be a veterinarian, but dreams are fragile things in places where the rent comes first. By adolescence, the softness of childhood had thinned into restlessness. He grew taller, more self-contained. The world around him, meanwhile, was changing in ways he could not articulate. Britain in the early 1970s was a country of contradictions. The optimism of the post-war years had curdled into discontent. Television promised modernity, but the streets told another story. Factories closing, strikes multiplying, and youth unemployment climbing with a steady inevitability. For young people like Clive, the future had become a rumor. Education felt abstract, work uninviting, and authority an echo of a generation that no longer understood its children. He attended Brighton Technical College for a time, but dropped out before sitting his O-levels. The reasons were never entirely clear. Some said he was bored, others that he had fallen in with the wrong crowd. Pauline suspected both. She would come home from work to find him gone, the radio left playing at low volume, the faint scent of cigarette smoke lingering near the window. Sometimes he returned late, disheveled but smiling, offering no explanation. She worried, but worry had become part of daily life, like hunger, like weather. When he was 16, he found work at the Gondola Cafe on Church Road, washing dishes for the night shift. It wasn't much, but it gave him purpose and a place to be. The cafe had a jukebox, a relic that seemed almost sacred to the local teenagers who gathered there. For the price of a few coins, one could command the room, if only for a song's length. Clive favored Jimi Hendrix and The Who, music that seemed to capture both yearning and defiance. He would lean against the counter, listening to the guitar distortion as though it were a sermon. Regulars noticed his habit of staying after hours, cleaning the machines, mopping the floor with quiet precision. Some evenings, when the last customers had gone, he would sit with a cup of coffee and stare through the steamed-up window toward the empty street, his reflection faint against the glass. In those moments, he seemed to belong to no one and nowhere, a boy suspended between innocence and the hard gravity of adulthood. But the streets outside the gondola were changing too. Youth culture, once vibrant with music and rebellion, had splintered into tribes. The glam rockers with their glittered jackets, the punks beginning to surface with torn clothes and rage, and then the biker gangs, the Hells Angels and their local imitations. Among these latter groups, the Mad Dogs of Sussex made their presence felt. They were not bikers in the true sense. Most had neither bikes nor steady work. What they had was an identity forged from scraps, army surplus jackets, patches, boots, and the language of defiance. Clive was drawn to them in the way a moth is drawn to heat. They represented danger, yes, but also belonging. They gathered in the underpasses near the seafront, smoking and talking about speed, about girls, about nothing. They were young men rehearsing adulthood without guidance, filling the silence with bravado. Pauline saw them once, standing in her doorway when Clive had invited them to watch television. Their laughter filled the small house, their presence heavy with arrogance. When she refused them entry, they left, dragging Clive with them. The next morning, he returned with a bruised eye and a swollen lip. He brushed off her concern, saying it was nothing. But she saw the change after that. The way he began to dress differently, the way his laughter grew louder, his silences longer. The police already knew of the Mad Dogs. They were infamous for brawls near Brighton Pier, for fights with skinheads and rival groups. They carried knives and wore steel-capped boots. Violence was their dialect, understood without translation. Clive, with his quiet demeanor and uncertain pride, became both participant and victim in their rituals. There were whispers of initiation ceremonies, of blood mixing and loyalty oaths taken over motorbike saddles. To belong was to surrender individuality. At home, Pauline found it harder to reach him. He would sleep through mornings, leave without breakfast, and come home reeking of cigarettes and beer. Once she found a small switchblade hidden in the lining of his jacket. She confronted him, but he only laughed, saying everyone carried one, just in case. She wanted to believe he was still good, still reachable, but motherhood often requires faith in defiance of evidence. By early 1973, things had worsened. Clive had been arrested for breaking into a shop and stealing radios. He was released with a warning after appearing before Hove Magistrates Court. The court receipt would later be found in his pocket, waterlogged and fragile. Pauline attended the hearing, sitting at the back with her hands clenched in her lap, listening to her son's voice, so polite, so distant, as he promised to stay out of trouble. Afterward, he told her it was over, that he would find honest work. She wanted to believe him, but the pull of the Mad Dogs was stronger. The gang had begun feuding with another local group calling themselves the Hells Angel Cougars. Clive, restless and unpredictable, shifted allegiance. He was tattooed with the letters HAC, perhaps as proof of loyalty or defiance. It was never clear. In small towns, rebellion is personal, betrayal is magnified. When he met Julie Harmon, the girl from school, he seemed momentarily softened. They spent hours walking along the seafront, talking about nothing in particular. She said he wanted to save money for a motorbike, though no one believed he ever would. He gave her a bracelet, cheap metal but engraved with care. For a time, Pauline thought he might steady himself. But then came the anger, the jealousy, the rumors, fights in cafes, disappearances for days at a time. He had begun experimenting with drugs, marijuana, perhaps LSD. Friends recalled him speaking about visions, about the occult, about finding power in darkness. It was fashionable in certain circles then, part rebellion, part search for meaning. But for Clive, it became another avenue of self-destruction. By February 1973, Pauline barely recognized her son. She saw flashes of the boy he had been, the tenderness, the awkward humor, but they were fleeting, like sunlight breaking briefly through clouds. When he left the house on the evening of the 28th, she asked if he would be home for supper. He smiled and said, "Don't wait up, Mum." She didn't know it would be the last time she heard his voice. After his disappearance, she lived between dread and denial. She called friends, checked hospitals, reported him missing. Days passed, then weeks. Each night she sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, imagining that any sound outside might be his return. In that waiting, the truth began to form like mist, unseen but inevitable. Somewhere between youth and violence, her son had vanished into the machinery of fear that governed the gang world. When his body surfaced 6 weeks later, it was less a revelation than a confirmation of what she had already known, that belonging had cost him everything. Now, In the official language of reports and postmortems, Clive Olive had become the victim. But for Pauline, he remained the boy who once fed stray cats and fell asleep with comic books on his chest. Her grief was not dramatic. It was quiet, repetitive, the kind that settles into the bones. Outside, the Gondola Cafe still played its records, the jukebox humming under dim light. The same music that once thrilled a restless boy now drifted like an elegy for a generation adrift. By the spring of 1973, the name Mad Dogs of Sussex had begun to drift through the conversations of parents, teachers, and constables like an unpleasant rumor. It was the kind of name that could only have been born in imitation, part bravado, part parody. The real Hell's Angels, with their American mythos of freedom and anarchy, seemed distant and unreachable. The Mad Dogs were the local translation, boys from Hove, Brighton, and Shoreham, who had borrowed the aesthetic but not the machinery. They wore leather jackets bought second-hand, scrawled with patches that flaked under the rain. They spoke of motorcycles they would never own and power they would never wield. Yet within their small universe, they believed themselves formidable. Their meeting places were ordinary, dingy cafes, abandoned warehouses, the underpasses by the seafront where the roar of traffic above could almost sound like engines revving. There were rarely more than 20 of them at once, though their numbers fluctuated with arrests and departures. Their hierarchy was fluid, their loyalties conditional. What bound them together was not purpose, but exclusion. They were united by what they lacked: steady work, stable homes, the sense of being seen. Police reports of the time described them as a loose and undisciplined association of disaffected youths. But that phrasing misses the reality. They were less an organization than a weather system, drifting, unpredictable, shaped by pressure from without. Violence was not strategic but ritualistic, a form of punctuation in a life without meaning. Fights with rival groups were common, particularly with skinheads and mods who wandered too close to their chosen territory. The Mad Dogs' weapons were simple: chains, bottles, steel-capped boots. The violence they inflicted was rarely lethal, but always deliberate, as if to prove that they existed at all. When Clive Olive first appeared among them, he was an outsider in the purest sense, too polite, too introspective, too visibly uncertain. Yet that uncertainty intrigued them. Every gang needs someone to dominate, someone to define themselves against. To them, Clive was both recruit and mirror. He wanted what they all wanted: to belong, to matter, and in that hunger lay his vulnerability. He began by shadowing them, following to their meetings, laughing a beat too late at their jokes. In the beginning, they teased him harmlessly, calling him Ollie the Thinker. But belonging required surrender, and the Mad Dogs demanded proof. Initiations, though inconsistent, carried a certain theatricality: stolen goods, petty vandalism, or small acts of cruelty dressed as courage. Clive complied. He was caught once breaking a shop window for a radio. It was his first and only arrest before his death. To the police, it was juvenile delinquency. To the Mad Dogs, it was evidence of commitment. Within the gang, every boy carried a name that replaced his own, a nickname that both erased and defined him. There was Simple, Bluey, Loner, Mouse, Butch. They were caricatures of themselves, performing versions of masculinity they had learned from film posters and pulp magazines. The nicknames allowed them to forget their real lives: the damp rooms, the fathers who drank, the endless waiting at employment offices. Among the Mad Dogs, they were reborn, however briefly, into something fierce and ungoverned. For all its posturing, the group's life was tedious. They spent long nights in the cafes of Hove, hunched over mugs of instant coffee they could barely afford, talking about bikes and fights they would never have. Occasionally, they rode stolen motorbikes through the narrow lanes, engines sputtering under the weight of their fantasies. Clive never had one. He walked beside them, his jacket buttoned tight, his hands shoved into his pockets. When the Clash would later sing, "I got my motorcycle jacket, but I'm walking all the time," It could have been written for boys like him, youths armed with symbols but denied the means to fulfill them. Observers might have seen the gang as laughable, but to those inside, the illusion was absolute. The rituals they invented, blood oaths, mock funerals, ceremonial beatings, provided structure in a world stripped of guidance. When Clive was finally accepted, it was through humiliation. On Brighton Beach, under the cold glare of streetlights, he was forced to kneel while others urinated on his clothes. They cut their arms and pressed the blood to his skin, calling him brother. He laughed afterward, though witnesses later said it sounded nervous, almost hysterical. He had crossed the threshold from outsider to initiate, and the price had been his dignity. The violence of the group was both outward and inward. They fought rivals to assert territory, but they turned on one another with equal ferocity. Betrayal was inevitable in a hierarchy built on insecurity. Clive's position was unstable from the start. He was erratic, sometimes absent from meetings, sometimes too eager. He tried to charm the girls who drifted around the edges of the gang, an act considered unforgivable. Within the Mad Dog's crude code, the women were communal property and emotional attachment was weakness. Clive's defiance, whether intentional or not, marked him for reprisal. Pauline noticed the changes without understanding their source. Her son's bruises became more frequent. His mood swung violently between affection and hostility. Once she heard him muttering in his room, repeating phrases she did not recognize. Something about strength, about loyalty. He was reading books about witchcraft, dabbling in the occult like many disillusioned youths of the time. Black magic, seances, rituals with candles and knives. To them, it was a rebellion against the moral exhaustion of their parents' world. To Pauline, it was madness. The Mad Dogs were no strangers to such performances. Some among them claimed to worship dark forces, carving symbols into their jackets, boasting of animal sacrifices. It was difficult to tell where play ended and belief began. In a world where institutions had failed, the occult offered an illusion of power, a private religion for the powerless. Clive's nickname within the gang was said to be Randy, or sometimes Ollie the Loner. He was both tolerated and ridiculed. They mocked his attempts at sophistication, his talk of books and dreams. Yet they kept him close, as if his difference gave them something to despise together. Violence within the group was sporadic but intimate. Fists, boots, laughter afterward. Once he was beaten so severely that he could not work for several days. When his mother asked, he said he had fallen off a curb. She wanted to believe it. The police had little control over the gang's activities. Local officers, overstretched and cynical, considered them nuisances rather than threats. But Detective Chief Superintendent James Marshall saw the pattern forming. The Mad Dogs were part of a broader symptom, a generation turning inward, their rage directed not at systems or politics, but at one another. Their violence was small, but it carried the echo of something larger, a society unraveling under its own contradictions. By late 1972, the group's internal rivalries had intensified. The Hells Angel Cougars, a splinter faction based near Hove, began to poach members. Clive was among those who drifted toward them, tired of his treatment by the Mad Dogs. He was drawn by the promise of belonging without ridicule, unaware that betrayal in such circles was not forgiven. His tattoo, HAC, was both declaration and death sentence. The divide between the two groups was less ideological than territorial. The Mad Dogs, humiliated by defections, plotted revenge. Their talk of loyalty turned to talk of punishment. Some boasted that they would drown their former leader or burn his bike. The words were bluster. But in that culture, bluster could become action with little warning. Clive's movements during those final weeks traced the fault lines between these factions. He worked his shifts, met Julie Harmon in secret, spoke to friends about leaving the gangs altogether. But freedom in such a world was an illusion. Every decision was a provocation. Looking back, investigators would see the inevitability of it all. the small humiliations accumulating like stones until the final act seemed less a murder than an execution of social logic. In a generation that mistook brutality for strength, Clive Olive had chosen the wrong kind of courage. By February 1973, he was already marked. The Mad Dogs had decided that loyalty demanded blood, and somewhere in the labyrinth of Brighton's alleys and underpasses, the plan for his death began to take shape. Outside, the sea kept its rhythm, erasing footprints from the sand as quickly as they appeared. In the weeks after Clive vanished, Pauline Olive lived inside the thin membrane of waiting that separates fear from certainty. Each morning she still made tea for two, still set out a second cup. Habit is the last defense of the bereaved before they admit the loss. She wrote his name on shopping lists, called softly up the stairs before leaving for work, as if the simple act of speaking might conjure him back. The police had taken her statement and assured her that boys often went off for a few days. Brighton's seafront, they said, was full of youth hostels, cafes, and cheap rooms. He might have gone to London. Perhaps he was with friends. Each reassurance, intended as comfort, only deepened her unease. Mothers know the difference between rebellion and disappearance. At night, she sat by the window, the curtains open to the glow of the street lamps. The sound of the sea carried faintly through the houses, a soft, irregular breathing. Sometimes she imagined footsteps on the pavement and rose quickly, only to find the street empty. The hours stretched without measure. She no longer listened to the radio. Music had become unbearable. Her neighbors were kind but cautious. In working-class streets like Norfolk Terrace, sympathy was offered in small, practical gestures: an extra loaf of bread, a note through the door, the loan of a vacuum cleaner. No one asked questions that might invite grief into their own homes. They had seen too many families swallowed by scandal: a son arrested, a daughter gone off, a husband who never came back from the pub. Pauline accepted their kindness and their silence alike. Each day she walked to the Gondola Cafe, peering through the windows as if her son might still be inside, wiping tables, laughing with friends. The jukebox played the same songs, but the sound seemed thinner now. She would stand there for a few minutes, pretending to read the menu before walking back into the cold. People began to recognize her routine, the solitary woman with the searching eyes, and stepped aside politely. She visited the police station again in early March, insisting something was wrong. The constable on duty took another report but offered no new hope. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, scribbling her details on a pad already half filled with other names. There were too many lost youths that year, too many mothers who waited. Meanwhile, Detective Marshall's investigation moved beneath the surface of her awareness. His officers interviewed teenagers, traced rumors of fights near the pier, and collected fragments of information that pointed toward the Mad Dogs. Each new lead tightened the circle, but to Pauline none of that was visible. She only felt the growing weight of not knowing. Her dreams turned cruel. She saw Clive standing in the doorway, dripping seawater, his eyes bright with apology. She would reach out to him, and he would vanish. Sometimes she woke convinced she could hear him calling from the street. Other times, she woke convinced she never would again. The social workers who visited spoke in bureaucratic tones about counseling and welfare payments. Their language, support, adjustment, coping mechanisms, sounded foreign in her kitchen. What she wanted was not comfort, but explanation. How could a boy who had once spent hours feeding stray cats become the subject of whispers about gangs and drugs? How could the same hands that held a guinea pig so gently be capable of theft and violence? In quieter moments, she blamed herself. She should have been stricter, or kinder, or both. She should have stopped him going out that last night. Guilt is the most democratic of emotions. It spares no parent. Yet beneath her self-reproach lay anger, not at Clive, but at the world that had enticed and then discarded him. The early 1970s had promised liberation, but for women like Pauline, it had delivered only exhaustion. Her wages barely covered rent. Inflation eroded what little she saved. Television showed images of youth culture, bright clothes, laughter, possibility, that bore no resemblance to her reality. She saw her son reflected in those images, reaching for something that had never been his to grasp. As March turned to April, the search notices faded from shop windows. The police had no new information. She began to sense a quiet withdrawal of attention, as though the world were politely stepping around her grief. Only the local paper called once, asking for a photograph for reference. She sent one taken when Clive was 12, his smile still unguarded. When it appeared in print, beneath the headline, "Teen Missing from Hove," she cut it out and placed it in a drawer. Then came the morning when the knock on the door finally came, not from her son, but from Detective Marshall. By then, she already knew. The body found in Aldrington Basin had been on the news, the description of the clothes, the location, the timing. Knowledge often arrives before confirmation. She opened the door with the slow composure of someone who has rehearsed the moment too many times. After the identification, after the officials and the forms, there was silence again. Grief did not announce itself. It settled gradually, like dust. The house seemed smaller now. She cleaned compulsively, as if tidiness could restore order. Clive's room remained untouched. The bed made, the books aligned, the cat still sleeping on the pillow. She attended the inquest weeks later, sitting at the back while the coroner spoke in dry sentences about asphyxia due to drowning and marks consistent with restraint. The words reduced her son to data. She listened, hands folded, until the proceedings ended. Outside, reporters waited, notebooks ready. She slipped past them without a word. At home that night, she lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. It burned for hours, its small flame trembling in the draft. From outside, passers-by might have mistaken it for decoration, but it was a signal to the sea, to the night, to whatever remained of the boy she had lost. Detective Marshall, reviewing his notes in the station, thought of her often. He understood that for investigators, cases ended with a verdict. For mothers, they never did. He wondered whether she had eaten, whether anyone visited. He knew that in such homes, loneliness could become a second death. Weeks later, when he informed her of the arrests, she listened without visible relief. Justice was an abstract word. Nothing could return what the water had taken. She thanked him politely, then closed the door and drew the curtains. The candle still stood on the sill, its wax hardened into a thin white river. In the years to come, she would move away from Hove, unable to bear the sound of gulls or the smell of salt. But for now, in that spring of 1973, she remained where everything had ended. The basin was only 2 miles away, yet it might as well have been another world. Outside, the evenings grew longer. The light lingered over the rooftops before fading into the sea. Pauline watched it from her window, neither hoping nor despairing, only enduring. The flame she had lit still burned in her mind, small, stubborn, unextinguished, against the gathering dark. The Gondola Cafe had changed little since the winter evenings when Clive Olive worked its night shift. The same cracked tiles, the same haze of cigarette smoke, and the faint hum of fluorescent tubes that gave every face a sickly glow. It was a place built on repetition, orders scribbled on slips, plates clattering, coins sliding across the counter. And yet, within that ordinary rhythm, the cafe had become a kind of chapel for the young. They came in groups, boys in denim jackets and boots, girls in cardigans and eyeliner, all leaning into the jukebox as if it were an oracle. The songs were brief, but in each one they heard the shape of their own lives, freedom promised and withheld, love found and lost in the same breath. In those days, music did not just fill the silence, it organized it. Clive had once been part of that congregation. He was not a leader among them, but he had presence. There was something in the way he moved through the room, quiet, self-contained, almost reverent. When he chose a song, he didn't swagger or boast. He waited, listening to the opening chords of Purple Haze or Hey Joe, as though testing the temperature of the air. The others would nod, recognizing the choice. For a few minutes, the cafe would belong to him. To his friends, Clive was a contradiction. He could talk about Hendrix and philosophy, but he could also pick a fight outside the arcade. He read pulp novels about lost cities and ancient curses, yet carried a knife in his boot. He was both thoughtful and reckless, both the observer and the spectacle. The younger boys admired him because he seemed to contain something they could not name, a quiet defiance that didn't rely on volume. They began calling him the Prophet, half in jest. It started one night when he leaned across the table and said, "We're all ghosts already, just waiting to be noticed." The phrase stuck, repeated in laughter and then in awe. Within the cafe's small mythology, it became part of his legend. When he wasn't there, others quoted him, half mocking, half believing. Even in absence, he filled the space. But prophets are rarely understood, and Clive's transformation from fascination to threat followed quickly. As his mood darkened, so did his influence. He began to talk about the inevitability of violence, how the world respected only force. He spoke of visions, of black candles burning in empty rooms, of faces seen in mirrors that weren't his own. LSD and sleepless nights had blurred the borders of his mind. His friends laughed nervously, unsure whether he was joking. The cafe's owner, an aging man named Harris, had seen too many young men drift in and out of ruin to be surprised. He remembered Clive as polite, even shy, the kind who said thank you after every shift. But by early 1973, something had shifted. The boy's eyes had taken on a faraway look, as if he were watching a world invisible to others. He spoke less, smiled rarely. The music that once animated him now seemed to irritate him, like a reminder of something lost. In the cafes and bars of Hove, talk of gangs had become part of the scenery. The mad dogs still lingered near the pier, restless and unmoored. They were no longer feared, just pitied. Their jackets were fraying, their mythology thinning. Clive's defection to the rival Hell's Angel Cougars had only deepened their decline. Betrayal in that fragile ecosystem of loyalty was an unforgivable sin. When people spoke of him now, it was with a mix of awe and resentment. He had been both insider and outcast, the boy who wanted to rise above them but could not escape the mud. They mocked his grand words, yet repeated them. They despised his independence, yet envied it. For Detective Marshall, piecing together Clive's final weeks was like mapping a constellation in a polluted sky, each star dim, each connection uncertain. Every teenager he interviewed told a different story. Some said Clive was trying to leave the gangs entirely. Others claimed he was planning something, a kind of revenge. One girl swore she'd seen him the night before he vanished, sitting on the seawall near the basin, staring at the water. When she called out to him, he didn't turn. He was just watching. Marshall took notes quietly, understanding that truth, in cases like this, rarely came in single lines. It emerged instead from patterns of behavior, from the way people remembered or misremembered. He studied the rhythm of Clive's life, the work, the gangs, the cafe, and saw what connected them. Each place offered a kind of belonging that dissolved as soon as he touched it. He thought often about that phrase, "We're all ghosts already." It struck him not as melodrama, but as diagnosis. These young people, stripped of opportunity and drowned in borrowed culture, were indeed living half-lives. They wandered between identities, seeking permanence in imitation. The gangs, the drugs, the violence, all were symptoms of the same hunger. One evening, after a long day of interviews, Marshall stopped at the Gondola Cafe. The place was half empty. A few teenagers lingered at the counter, their faces pale in the electric light. He ordered a coffee and sat near the jukebox. The machine was still playing Hendrix, the same song Clive had favored. For a moment, time seemed circular, as though the boy might walk in again, mop in hand, ready to close up. Instead, the detective saw only reflections, the warped shapes of strangers, the tired eyes of the living. The cafe smelled of oil and nostalgia. When the song ended, no one selected another. The silence that followed was heavy, almost respectful. He left a coin on the counter and stepped outside. The night air was damp, carrying the faint roar of the sea. Across the street, two boys in denim jackets were arguing, their voices muffled by the wind. For a second, Marshall imagined that Clive might have once stood where they were, caught in the same invisible machinery of pride and despair. He walked toward the harbor, his coat collar turned up. The streets of Hove were quiet at that hour, the windows glowing softly behind drawn curtains. The city was asleep, but beneath its surface something still stirred, the restless energy of youth without purpose, the lingering echo of guitars and shouted laughter. At the basin, the water was calm again. The ripples from passing ships glimmered under the sodium lamps. Marshall leaned on the railing and looked down. He thought about the boy who had stood there, perhaps looking into the same black depths, and wondered whether he had sensed what was coming. Some people, he knew, could feel the weight of their own endings long before the world caught up. The investigation was tightening now. The names of the mad dogs were on his list. The van seen near the basin had been traced to a man named Albert Dawn. His brother-in-law, Brian Moore, was known to police, volatile, charismatic, and capable of cruelty. The pieces were aligning, though the picture they formed was not yet clear. Behind every crime, Marshall had learned, there was a moment of silence, a hesitation before the act, a chance for mercy. He wondered if such a moment had existed for Clive, whether someone had paused before tying the ropes, before dropping the body into the harbor. Perhaps not. In certain kinds of violence, hesitation was the first thing to die. The wind picked up, scattering paper wrappers across the quay. Somewhere in the distance, a song began again, faint and distorted, a jukebox still spinning, unaware that its prophet had long since fallen silent. The first whisper of the Hell's Angel Cougars reached Detective Marshall through a trembling witness, another boy, 16, who insisted on being called Rex. He said the Cougars weren't like the Mad Dogs. They were the real thing, serious men, not kids playing at being outlaws. But in truth, they were little more than an imitation of an imitation, a small group of disenchanted youths who had absorbed the symbols of rebellion but none of its structure. Their power was performative, and their danger, as Marshall would come to understand, lay in how deeply they believed their own theater. The Cougars had splintered off from the Mad Dogs months earlier after an argument that began, as such things often did, with a girl. A beating followed, and afterward the new faction declared itself independent. They took the name from an article about American biker gangs in a discarded magazine, drawn to the image of the animal, solitary, silent, predatory. Their jackets bore a crude, hand-painted emblem of a snarling cat. Beneath it, each member stitched his nickname in uneven white thread. They held no bikes between them, but they spoke as if the roads belonged to them. It was into this fragile brotherhood that Clive Olive drifted after his humiliation among the Mad Dogs. To the Cougars, his defection was proof of their superiority. To Clive, it was a reprieve, a chance to shed the bruises of the past. But allegiance demanded proof, and proof demanded a mark. The tattooist was a boy with a penknife and a bottle of ink. The letters HAC were carved into Clive's forearm under the dim light of a single bulb in a garden shed. Blood mingled with cheap alcohol. Someone laughed and said it looked official. Clive laughed too, though his laughter was thin, already uncertain. The Cougars operated out of the back room of a billiards hall near Brighton Station. The owner, an aging veteran, turned a blind eye in exchange for quiet. There they plotted their minor escapades, raids on rival cafes, small thefts, confrontations with the Mad Dogs that never escalated beyond shoving matches. To outsiders, it was meaningless bravado, but to boys who had never been listened to, even the illusion of control was intoxicating. Clive's new companions called him Ollie Cougar, a name half mocking and half affectionate. He carried himself differently now, his shoulders squared, his speech roughened by borrowed slang. Yet beneath the new posture lay the same fragile uncertainty that had always marked him. He was, Marshall would later write, a boy rehearsing confidence against the echo of his own doubt. For a time, it worked. The Cougars embraced him, flattered him, treated him as a prize stolen from their enemies. He found himself attending their meetings, drinking cheap cider from shared bottles, listening to talk of loyalty and vengeance. But the cohesion of such groups was shallow. Admiration quickly turned to suspicion. When Clive began to speak about leaving altogether, about finding steady work, about his mother's worry, they laughed. No one left, they told him. To leave was to betray. Marshall pieced together these details from interviews conducted months later, after arrests had been made and the myths began to unravel. But even stripped of their self-glorifying stories, the pattern was clear. Clive had walked a narrow line between belonging and exile, and on both sides of it waited violence. By mid-February, tension between the Mad Dogs and the Cougars had sharpened. The Mad Dogs, led unofficially by a tall, red-haired man named Brian Moore, had begun to talk openly of punishment. Moore was 21, older than most, and already carried a record of theft and assault. To him, leadership was not about guidance, but about fear. When he spoke, the younger boys listened with the wary attention of dogs, sensing a whip. He claimed to have contacts with real angels from London, a boast as hollow as it was effective. Within his circle, rumor hardened quickly into truth. Moore's hatred of Clive went beyond pride. There was history between them, fragments of which the investigation later unearthed. A girl named Jane Anson, 16, had once dated Clive briefly before meeting Moore. She had told him a story of coercion, of humiliation, of a night she could not forget. Whether the account was true or not, no one could ever prove, but to Moore it was enough. He spoke of retribution as if it were sacred duty. The gang's petty rituals acquired a new focus, revenge given purpose by moral outrage. Clive seemed unaware of the danger. He still came to the Gondola Café, still walked the same streets, though now he looked over his shoulder more often. Julie Harmon remembered him telling her that the Mad Dogs were out for blood, but that he didn't believe they'd dare. He said it with a grin meant to be reassuring, but his hands trembled when he lit his cigarette. She asked him to stay away from the harbor, and he promised he would. He lied. Detective Marshall saw in these intertwined loyalties the anatomy of the time itself. The 1970s had inherited from the previous decade both freedom and despair. The optimism of youth culture had curdled into cynicism. The collective dreams of the 60s had fragmented into tribes of the disillusioned. Each group sought meaning in its own small rebellion, mistaking performance for power. Clive's tragedy was not only personal, but generational. He had been born into a moment when the country itself no longer knew what it believed. In his report, Marshall noted the sociological undercurrent with clinical precision. Subcultural identity functioning as surrogate family. Group hierarchy replaces paternal absence. Violence operates as currency of belonging. But behind those sterile phrases lay the image of a boy kneeling on Brighton Beach, rain mixing with seawater and blood, believing that submission could earn him safety. As February drew to its close, witnesses recalled seeing Clive in the company of two men matching the description of Brian Moore and his brother-in-law, Albert Dawn. They were driving a black Austin van with peeling paint and a missing hubcap. The vehicle would later be found scrubbed clean, its carpet replaced. At the time, it was just another shadow passing through the dim streets of Hove. On the night of the 28th, the last day Clive was seen alive, the Cougars were rumored to have met near the basin. Some said Clive had gone there to settle a dispute. Others believed he was lured. The distinction, Marshall knew, was academic. By the time the van's doors closed, his fate was sealed. The detective often returned in thought to that moment, the intersection of fear and trust that precedes every act of betrayal. He imagined Clive stepping into the van, perhaps thinking the worst that could happen was another beating. He imagined the engine starting, the road unspooling toward the harbor, the water waiting, indifferent as ever. In later statements, witnesses would describe the sea that night as flat as glass. The moon hung low, its reflection broken only by the occasional ripple from a passing boat. The town slept, the streetlights flickered, and somewhere beneath them, 3 figures conspired against the illusion of mercy. The Cougars would splinter soon after the murder, their brotherhood dissolving under the weight of police scrutiny. The Mad Dogs, too, would scatter. Their names would fade from record, their legends reduced to rumor. But in that brief season of cruelty, they had achieved what they mistook for immortality, a story that outlived them. When Marshall filed his final report on the gangs, he closed it with a single line uncharacteristic in its emotion. They built their empire from imitation and blood, and like all such empires, it sank. Outside the station, the wind from the channel rattled the windows. Somewhere beyond the city, waves broke against the shore with the same indifferent rhythm that had carried the boy's body to the surface. The detective closed his eyes for a moment, hearing in that endless motion the echo of a generation lost to its own reflection. When the investigation turned to the bracelet, the story began to take on a shape that was almost human again. Until then, Clive Olive had been little more than a set of details, a drowned body, a tattoo, a name confirmed through a palm print. But that small piece of jewelry, cheap metal, slightly corroded by seawater, carried with it the trace of emotion that no police report could fully catalog. On one side it read Ollie, on the other, Julie. The name was an anchor, delicate, but undeniable. Detective Chief Superintendent James Marshall ordered that every teenage girl named Julie in the Hove and Brighton area be traced and interviewed. It was slow work. The name was common, and the faces all blurred together in the constable's reports. School photographs, youth club rosters, addresses scribbled in faint pencil. But eventually, one matched. Julie Harmon, 15, of Lansdowne Street. She answered the door herself when officers arrived. A small, pale girl with nervous hands, she looked younger than her years. Her mother hovered in the background, wary but cooperative. Julie was polite, subdued, her voice barely audible at first. "Yes," she said. She had known Clive. They had been close for a while, but not anymore. She had last seen him in February, not long before he disappeared. The questions were simple at first: how long they'd been together, where they met, whether they'd argued. Then Marshall asked about the bracelet. She hesitated, eyes darting toward her mother before settling on the floor. "He gave it to me at the cafe," she said softly. "He said it was so I'd remember him." Marshall asked why she hadn't kept it. "I gave it back," she replied after a pause. "We'd broken up. I didn't want it anymore." The tone of that statement, half guilt, half resignation, lingered in the room. It was the sound of adolescence closing in on tragedy. Over the next hour, Julie told them the story that filled in the final pieces of Clive's short life. They had met the previous autumn at a youth club, the kind run by local councils in an attempt to keep teenagers off the streets. Clive had stood apart from the others that first night, leaning against a wall, flicking through a paperback while a record player sputtered out pop songs. He was older, quieter, and Julie, like many girls her age, was drawn to that quietness. He walked her home after the meeting, talking about music and the sea. At first, their time together was harmless. Walks along the promenade, shared cups of coffee, hours spent at the Gondola Cafe where he worked. He would talk about saving for a motorbike, about wanting to leave Hove, maybe go north where no one knew him. She remembered the way he smiled when he said it, as if he believed distance could erase the past. But by winter, the changes had begun. He grew erratic, sometimes affectionate, sometimes distant. He mentioned the Mad Dogs, then later the Cougars. Julie had no interest in gangs, but she could tell they held a dangerous pull over him. He talked about loyalty and respect, words that seemed too large for a 16-year-old's vocabulary. Once, when she asked why he needed them, he replied simply, "Because they need me." She saw the bruises, of course. He always had a story ready. He'd fallen, he'd been jumped. It was nothing. But one night he arrived at her door trembling, blood on his shirt, eyes wild. He said he'd been beaten by the mad dogs for missing a meeting. She tried to persuade him to go to the police, but he laughed bitterly. "They won't help," he said. "They never do." That was when she decided to end it. She told him she couldn't live like that, waiting for the next fight, the next mood. He listened quietly, then handed her the bracelet. "Keep it," he said, "for luck." But she returned it days later, slipping it into his pocket when he wasn't looking. "I didn't want any of it," she told Marshall now, tears forming. "I just wanted him to stop." Marshall listened without interruption. He had learned that silence drew out more truth than interrogation. When Julie finished, he thanked her and promised she wouldn't have to see the police again. But as he stood to leave, she said something that made him pause. "They hated him," she whispered. "The mad dogs. They said he'd betrayed them. They said they'd do him in one day." Her mother tried to hush her, but Marshall nodded slowly, his mind already tracing the lines of cause and effect. Betrayal, vengeance, humiliation, the familiar triad of youth, violence. Back at headquarters, he laid the bracelet on his desk. It caught the fluorescent light, casting a faint reflection onto his notes. He thought of the boy who had once given it, the girl who had once worn it, and the terrible simplicity with which affection could become a death sentence in that world. In another time, in another place, their story would have been unremarkable. 2 teenagers, a falling out, a broken heart. But in 1970s Britain, even tenderness had a violent echo. Marshall's report that evening was brief but precise. He noted that the engraving established a personal link between victim and witness, that the breakup may have precipitated conflict with other gang members, and that jealousy or revenge might have been motives. But beneath the official phrasing, a darker understanding was forming. In Clive's world, violence was not an aberration. It was the grammar by which emotions were expressed. Love, loyalty, and anger all shared the same vocabulary. Meanwhile, the interviews continued. Other girls spoke of Clive's charm, his volatility, his unpredictable shifts from laughter to rage. One, a neighbor from Norfolk Terrace, recalled how he had once boasted that he could make any girl love him for the price of a coffee. It was bravado, of course, but it revealed something fundamental, his need to be seen, to matter. Marshall knew that this kind of need was dangerous. In the absence of family stability or social respect, young men often sought affirmation through control, over women, over friends, over fear itself. When the illusion of control failed, violence followed. As the evidence grew, so did the detective's unease. He could sense the case approaching a threshold, the moment when the dead boy's story would cease to be his alone and become the property of the law, the press, and the public imagination. There was still a mystery to solve, a killer to identify, but beyond that lay something less tangible, a reckoning with the world that had created both victim and murderer. That night, long after the station had emptied, Marshall remained at his desk. The bracelet lay beside his notes, cool to the touch. He imagined Clive's last evening, the dim light of the cafe, the sound of a jukebox, the weight of rejection pressing down. Perhaps he had walked to the harbor not in fear, but in exhaustion. Perhaps he had thought the water would listen when no one else did. Outside, the wind swept in from the channel, rattling the windows. The city slept, unaware that its small dramas were aligning into something far greater than rumor. Soon there would be arrests, headlines, and the spectacle of justice. But for now, in the quiet of the office, it was just a story of 2 names carved into cheap metal, and a boy who had believed that love might save him from the tide. By the early months of 1973, Brighton and Hove stood at a peculiar crossroads. The glamour of the seaside resort, its arcades, its pier, its echo of Victorian leisure, had faded into something ghostly. The hotels, once bright with summer tourists, were peeling at the edges. The promenades that had once been symbols of affluence now carried the slow shuffle of pensioners and the restless footsteps of the young who had nowhere else to go. Behind the facades of painted terraces lay the small tragedies of post-war Britain, unemployment, overcrowding, and the quiet corrosion of belief in the future. It was here, in these divided streets, that a new kind of youth was forming, caught between inherited politeness and the hunger for rebellion. The city was a mirror of the country itself, the working class stranded between old certainties and modern disillusionment. Wages had stagnated, unions were at war with employers, and the promise of social mobility had begun to dissolve. For the young, life was no longer about progress, but endurance. Marshall understood this better than most. He had grown up in the same kind of streets, though 2 decades earlier. He knew how easily frustration could harden into defiance, and defiance into cruelty. As he moved through the cafes, the clubs, the schoolyards that served as his interview rooms, he saw the same story unfold again and again. Boys raised on discipline without affection, girls judged more harshly for their missteps than any man would ever be, and behind it all, a state that seemed to have forgotten its children. The gangs that haunted Brighton's nightlife were less causes than symptoms. They filled the vacuum left by the erosion of community. Once the docks and factories had offered apprenticeship, purpose, camaraderie. Now those spaces stood half empty, their gates locked, their signs fading. The boys who might have been dock workers or machinists became self-made outlaws, mimicking the American freedom they saw in films but could never truly touch. They were dangerous because they were pretending not to be afraid. In police files, their names looked interchangeable. Each carried a list of minor offenses: theft, assault, possession. But to the detective, what mattered was not the crime itself, but the ecosystem that produced it. The mad dogs of Sussex, the Hell's Angel cougars, the skinheads who fought them, all were born from the same poverty of meaning. Their violence was a kind of language, crude but legible. Each act said, "We exist. We will not be ignored." Marshall spent his evenings walking through the neighborhoods where the gangs gathered. He would stop outside cafes, listening to the laughter that spilled into the street, sharp and uncertain. Once he saw a group of boys in torn denim clustered around a motorbike with no engine. They took turns revving it, pretending it roared. When he passed, they fell silent, their expressions defiant but brittle. He recognized that look, the need to appear unshaken in a world that kept moving without you. For the girls, life was no easier. In the cafes and dance halls, they were both participants and prizes, courted one day and scorned the next. The justice system judged them more harshly. The newspapers painted them as temptresses or victims depending on what sold more copies. Julie Harmon's tearful statement, recorded in the police files, would later be quoted in the tabloids, with cruel embellishment. It was easier for society to pity her than to confront the failure that had placed a 15-year-old in the orbit of gangs and murderers. The moral panic surrounding youth culture had begun long before Clive's death. Politicians blamed television, rock music, American influence. But the roots ran deeper. It was not the songs that bred violence, it was the silence that followed them. In that silence, whole communities felt abandoned, left to navigate modernity without direction. The young filled the void with symbols, leather jackets, tattoos, slogans. Each was a shield against invisibility. Marshall's notes from that period, later archived under sociological observations, read almost like scripture. These are not revolutionaries, they are orphans of industry. Their rebellion is a plea disguised as threat. He understood. though he could not say so publicly that arresting them would not solve anything. Policing could contain violence, but it could not cure despair. Meanwhile, the newspapers fed on the story. The Brighton Argus ran headlines about biker cults and satanic youths, recycling the old fears of post-war moral collapse. Reporters crowded outside the police station, their pens eager for another scandal. They wrote of blood oaths and black magic, exaggerating fragments until they became myth. The murder of Clive Olive became more than a crime. It became a symbol of what the nation feared it was becoming. For Pauline Olive, the attention was unbearable. Strangers sent letters, some sympathetic, others cruel. A preacher from London wrote to tell her that her son's death was divine retribution for sin. She burned the letter unread. She had no patience for theology. What haunted her was not the notion of punishment, but the simplicity of her son's end. A van, a rope, a body in the water. Marshall, too, found himself recoiling from the public hunger for spectacle. He avoided interviews, issued statements through subordinates. His focus remained on the people directly involved, the suspects, the witnesses, the survivors. Each conversation reminded him that beneath the posturing of gangs and the posturing of newspapers lay the same human need, the need to be seen and the terror of being forgotten. As the investigation progressed, the detective began to notice how closely the town's geography mirrored its psychology. The seafront glittered under arcades and lights, but behind it stretched labyrinths of narrow streets, damp lodgings, and half-empty factories. Respectability and decay lived side by side, each pretending not to see the other. It was this tension that defined Brighton's youth, half-dreamers, half-delinquents, children of a country that had lost its faith in itself. One night, as Marshall walked home along the promenade, he saw the reflection of the pier lights tremble on the black water. The tide was coming in, slow and unstoppable. He thought of Clive's body rising from the depths weeks earlier, of the way death seemed to surface only when the current allowed it. In some ways, the entire nation felt like that harbor, a collection of sunken stories, waiting for turbulence to bring them into view. By the end of March, the case had entered its decisive phase. The black van had been traced, the suspects identified, but Marshall sensed that what he was uncovering was larger than a murder. It was a microcosm of Britain's fracture, class against class, generation against generation, decency, eroded by despair. In every interview, he heard the same refrain: "No one cares, so we do what we want." It was not pride, but resignation. The detective closed his notebook and looked out over the sea once more. The gulls circled above the dark water, their cries sharp as glass. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay Europe, prosperous and intact. Behind him lay England, tired and uncertain. He knew which direction the tide was moving. Tomorrow he would question the men whose names had begun to solidify into guilt: Brian Moore, Albert Dawn, and Christine Dawn, known as Butch. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment to breathe in the salt air, heavy with the scent of rust and rain. The waves broke softly against the stones, indifferent as ever. The city lights flickered, and the wind carried the faint echo of laughter from a distant pub. Young voices rising, then fading. For a moment, it sounded like life returning. Then it was gone. It was always the van that people remembered first. A dull black Austin with patches of primer showing through the paint, its rear doors misaligned and one headlight dimmer than the other. It had been seen too many times that winter, rolling slowly through Hove's back streets like an omen, its muffler coughing, its engine straining against the wind that came off the sea. To some, it was just another scrap vehicle among hundreds that lined the curbs. To others, those who paid attention, it was the shadow that lingered after the laughter of the mad dogs faded from the alleyways. Detective Chief Superintendent James Marshall first heard of it in a statement from a dock worker. The man had been walking home late on February 28th, the night Clive Olive disappeared, when he noticed the van driving out of Aldrington Basin. It was nearly midnight. He recalled that the vehicle moved slowly, too slowly, its engine idling as though waiting for permission to leave. He couldn't see who was inside, only the faint orange glow of a cigarette burning in the driver's hand. The next morning, when the news of the body surfaced, he remembered and reported what he'd seen. The van became a fixed point in the map of the case. Officers traced its registration to a laborer named Albert Dawn, 27 years old, living with his wife Christine in a rented house on the outskirts of Brighton. The address matched another name already in the police files: Brian Moore, Christine's brother. The threads began to converge. Marshall reviewed their records: small-time offenses, fights, petty theft. But the details of their lives told a deeper story, one written in deprivation, violence, and a kind of inherited despair that moved quietly from one generation to the next. Moore had been placed in care at 14. Dawn had grown up in the same neighborhood as the Mad Dogs. Christine, known among them as Butch, was 8 months pregnant. The three of them formed a small, combustible unit, bound by family, resentment, and a shared fascination with the illusion of power. The black van, it turned out, was Albert's pride. It had been bought second-hand from a scrap dealer, the seats patched with old blankets, the dashboard held together with wire. He used it for odd jobs, delivering building materials, carting rubbish, but he also used it as a symbol, a kind of stage on wheels. Within the gang, ownership of a vehicle, however shabby, conferred authority. It was a moving territory, a private room where alliances were formed and secrets buried. In the last week of February, neighbors noticed the van more often than usual. It came and went at strange hours, its engine rumbling under the thin walls of terraced houses. One woman later recalled hearing raised voices from inside: Brian's harsh laugh, Christine's sharper one, and another voice she didn't recognize, younger, uncertain. The argument ended with the slam of the back doors and the engine roaring to life. No one thought to report it then. Arguments were as common as the rain. Marshall reconstructed the night of the murder piece by piece. The timeline was maddeningly ordinary at first. Clive leaving his home around 6 in the evening, spotted near the cafe, seen later near the pier. Several witnesses placed him with 2 men matching the descriptions of Moore and Dawn between 9 and 10 o'clock. They appeared friendly, almost casual. One said they were laughing together, another that Clive looked nervous. Then the 3 vanished into the night. The detective imagined the scene as he read the statements. The van parked under a broken streetlight, the sound of the sea in the distance, the cold metal door sliding open, a voice, perhaps Brian's, inviting Clive inside with the promise of a drink or a smoke or simply the reassurance of belonging. It would have been easy. He trusted them once. He wanted to believe he could again. Inside the van, the air would have been thick with the smell of oil and damp carpet. The rope and the blue plastic bags lay in the corner, taken from a building site earlier that day. Concrete blocks, heavy and impersonal, waited beside them. The decision had already been made. The ritual was merely its enactment. Marshall knew from experience that violence often carried a strange calm before it broke. The participants, once committed, moved through it as if rehearsed. He could picture Moore at the wheel, his expression hard with self-righteousness. Dawn beside him, smaller, quieter, obedient. In the back, Christine, watching, saying little. The van trundling toward the harbor, headlights trembling over puddles, the night wind whistling through the gaps in the doors. When the confession would later come, Moore described it with unnerving detachment. He said they had met Clive under the pretext of offering him drugs. In the van, he confronted him about Jane Anson, the 16-year-old girl who claimed Clive had assaulted her. Moore demanded the truth. Clive denied it, then hesitated. "I only raped her once," he supposedly said. Whether he truly uttered those words or Moore invented them later, no one could prove. But they became the spark that ignited the fatal rage. The first blow came without warning. The truncheon, a nightstick Moore had kept from his job as a security guard, struck the side of Clive's head. He fell sideways, stunned, his hands raised. Another blow followed. Blood splattered the van's interior, dark and wet. Albert swore, complaining about the mess. Christine shouted something, no one could recall what. And then silence. The kind of silence that only follows irreversible acts. Moore told the court that he believed Clive was dead. "I thought I'd lost my temper," he said, "and I thought I might as well finish it." But Marshall suspected that the truth was simpler. He wanted to watch him die. They tied the body with rope, the blocks to his wrists and ankles, and drove to the basin. The wind had risen by then, carrying a fine mist off the channel. Dawn reversed the van to the edge, its tires slipping slightly on the damp concrete. They lifted the body together, heaving against the dead weight. Moore later said the sound that haunted him most was not the splash, but the bubbles that rose afterward, the brief, gurgling protest of air escaping from lungs. It was like he was trying to talk, he said, but he couldn't. The van drove away, its wheels streaked with mud. Behind it, the basin closed over, erasing the evidence. Marshall visited the harbor often in those weeks after the confession, not from necessity, but from compulsion. He would stand where they had stood, the air sharp with salt, and try to imagine the absence that followed. Murder was always easier to describe than to understand. The act itself was physical, but what it left behind was metaphysical, an emptiness that seeped into every corner of the town. The van was found days later, parked near the Don's house, its interior freshly painted. Forensics uncovered traces of blood in the seams of the floorboards. The smell of bleach clung to the upholstery. It was enough. When Marshall saw it for the first time, under the pale lights of the police garage, he was struck by how ordinary it looked. Small, dented, anonymous. A vehicle of errands, not executions. Yet in its metal shell lay the echo of an entire country's decay. Poverty turned inward, loyalty curdled into cruelty, the illusion of justice twisted into personal vengeance. As he left the garage that night, he paused at the door. Outside, rain fell in thin silver lines across the forecourt. Somewhere, a radio played faintly from an officer's car. A pop song, cheerful and absurd. It drifted through the air, colliding with the rhythmic patter of rain. Marshall stood listening for a moment, realizing that this was England in its truest form, tragedy framed by banality, cruelty dissolving into weather. Tomorrow he would interrogate the Dons and their brother, but tonight he walked into the rain, coat collar raised, the city's sodium lights bleeding into the puddles beneath his feet. The harbor was sleeping again, the water dark and still, holding its secrets close. When Detective Chief Superintendent James Marshall finally stood before the three accused, Brian Moore, Albert Don, and Christine Don, he felt less that he was confronting monsters than that he was staring into the worn faces of England's decline. They were young, yet already eroded by life, their expressions carrying the habitual dullness of people who had long ago stopped expecting mercy. The violence that had destroyed Clive Olive's body seemed, in them, not extraordinary, but inevitable. Brian Moore sat furthest from the table. He was 21, broad-shouldered, with the pale, freckled skin of a man who worked indoors, but carried himself like a laborer. His red hair, tied back in a ragged ponytail, caught the light whenever he moved. There was a restless energy about him, a kind of theatrical volatility that turned even stillness into a performance. His record was as inconsistent as his temperament. Thefts, assaults, short stints of work in zoos and theme parks where his temper had driven him out. Yet he had charisma, the dangerous kind that often passes for leadership among the disoriented. Albert Don looked older, though he was younger. 5'3", covered in tattoos, his small frame seemed almost folded in on itself. He smiled frequently, but the smile was defensive, a way to hide thought. He'd been a laborer most of his life, accustomed to taking orders, first from his father, later from his wife, and finally from his brother-in-law. He rarely spoke unless prompted, and when he did, his sentences wandered off halfway through, as if words cost too much effort. Then there was Christine, Butch, as the others called her. At 18, she was tall, almost statuesque, with the build of someone used to fighting her way through the world. She was 8 months pregnant when Marshall questioned her, one hand resting absently on the curve of her belly, as if to remind herself she was still tethered to life. Her face was handsome in a hard way, the kind of face that could look beautiful or brutal depending on the light. They lived together in a narrow house that smelled of damp and cigarette smoke. The walls were covered with cheap prints of skulls and motorcycles, and over the bed hung a large Nazi flag. A souvenir, they said, from a friend's flat. When officers had searched the place, they found boxes of amphetamines, a broken truncheon, and stacks of pulp magazines about the Hells Angels. There was also a baby's cot in the corner, half assembled. Marshall had studied enough domestic murder cases to recognize the pattern: violence bred in close quarters, resentment fed by dependency. Each of them had grown up in homes where cruelty was casual, where being hit was a form of punctuation, not outrage. For people like them, brutality wasn't an interruption of ordinary life. It was ordinary life. Brian's father, George Moore, was a violent man who had once been reprimanded by police for beating his children so severely that neighbors intervened. Christine, too, had been a victim, assaulted as a child by one of her father's friends, sent to an approved school that was more punishment than refuge. Albert, orphaned young, had drifted through foster homes until he was old enough to disappear. They had each survived their pasts, but survival came at a cost. Empathy stripped away, replaced by suspicion and pride. In the interview room, Marshall spoke quietly, avoiding accusation. He asked about the night of February 28th, about the van, about Clive. For a time, all three denied everything. Then the stories began to diverge. Albert claimed ignorance. He said Brian had asked him for a lift and he'd agreed. Christine insisted she'd stayed home. Brian sat silent, arms crossed, his eyes flicking between them with a faint smile. When the forensic results arrived, the blood in the van, the concrete dust on their clothes, he stopped smiling. He did not confess so much as narrate, delivering his version with a strange calm, as though recounting a scene from someone else's life. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, "but he deserved what he got." His justification was a blend of moral outrage and self-pity. He spoke of Jane Anson, of betrayal, of honor. In his mind, he had not committed murder, but justice. Marshall listened without comment. He'd heard such reasoning before, the delusion that violence restores balance, that punishment redeems. But behind the words lay something older, the primitive need to assert control in a life defined by humiliation. When Brian said, "I did Brighton a favor," he wasn't boasting. He was consoling himself. Albert's version was less coherent. He admitted helping tie the body, but claimed fear. "He told me to," he said. "I didn't want no trouble." Fear, Marshall thought, was often the truest accomplice. Christine, under pressure, finally admitted being present. Her statement was fragmented, written in the uneven handwriting of someone unused to self-reflection. "I didn't touch him," she wrote. "I just watched. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop him." The detective believed her. Not in her innocence. She was guilty of inaction, but in her paralysis. Women like Christine had been raised to see violence as inevitable, as something to be endured rather than resisted. Her body was its own testimony, bruises on her arms, an old scar on her jaw. In another life, she might have been a witness for the prosecution instead of the accused. Marshall left the interrogation room that evening with the familiar heaviness that followed every solved crime. The satisfaction of resolution was tainted by the knowledge that nothing had truly been resolved. 3 damaged people had destroyed a 4th, and the law would punish them, but the machinery that produced them would continue to turn. That night, he sat alone in his office, rereading their statements. He noticed the language of possession: my van, my sister, my girl, my justice. Each phrase reduced another human being to property. Even their violence was territorial. He wondered if that was all England had become, a country of ownership without belonging. In the days that followed, the public devoured the story. The tabloids described the trio as Hell's Angel killers, painting them as demons in leather. Photographs of Christine, her belly round beneath her prison smock, appeared under lurid headlines. The narrative was irresistible: sex, youth, death, and corruption. But the truth was less cinematic. They were not villains in a morality play. They were what poverty, neglect, and rage could sculpt when left unchallenged. Marshall attended the preliminary hearing at Lewis Crown Court. As the defendants were led in, he observed them quietly. Christine looked pale, but defiant. Albert avoided her gaze. Brian strutted as if the dock were a stage, his smirk aimed not at the judge, but at the crowd. When the charges were read, murder with malice aforethought, he nodded as though approving the choice of words. Outside the courthouse, rain fell steadily, flattening the reporters' notebooks. Marshall stood beneath the eaves, watching the crowd disperse. The onlookers were mostly ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, mothers, retirees, drawn not by fascination with evil, but by curiosity about the shape of it. He could not blame them. The line between decency and brutality had always been thinner than anyone liked to admit. He thought again of Clive Olive, the boy who had wandered between belonging and betrayal. In death, Clive had become a symbol, a vessel into which the town poured its guilt. Yet the real story lay not in symbols, but in the ordinariness of those who killed him. Their faces, when stripped of newspaper gloss, were unremarkable. That was the most frightening truth of all. As the court adjourned, Marshall returned to his car. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of the sea even this far inland. He rolled down the window and listened. Somewhere beyond the town, waves were breaking against the harbor walls, the same tide that had brought the boy back from darkness. He started the engine, the sound merging with the distant rumble of thunder. The investigation was nearly complete. What remained was the trial, the judgment, the slow machinery of justice grinding toward its conclusion. But he knew that when the verdicts came, they would not bring closure. Only the faint illusion of order in a world built on chance. The black van, now impounded and silent, sat in the police yard like a relic. Rain pooled in its roof. In another season, another story, it might have been repaired, sold, driven again by someone unaware of its history. That was England, too. Everything recycled, nothing truly erased. Marshall turned the key, pulling away from the curb. The courthouse receded behind him, its lights glowing faintly through the rain. Ahead, the road curved toward the sea, and the horizon dissolved into mist. Somewhere, between justice and futility, the truth waited, quiet as the tide. When Jane Anson finally agreed to speak, the room changed. Marshall would later remember how the light slanted through the blinds, falling across the table in thin, uneven bars, the kind that divided truth from denial. She was 16, slight, freckled, the kind of girl who still bit her nails when frightened, and she carried herself with the uneasy grace of someone who had been forced to grow up before she was ready. For weeks, she had been only a name in the investigation, a thread connecting the accused to the victim and the story that wound through gossip. A romance soured, a betrayal avenged. But when she sat down before Marshall, the case that had been built on evidence and conjecture suddenly turned human again. There was a trembling honesty in her posture that made every word feel heavier. Her statement began without theatrics. She said she had met Brian Moore the previous year at a fairground outside Brighton. He had been working the rides tall and loud, pretending to be older than he was. She liked his confidence, his easy smile. Her parents approved of him at first. He seemed kind, protective even. They started seeing each other more often, walking along the promenade or meeting for chips after school. She said he made her laugh, and when he bought her a small ring from a Seaside shop, she had believed it meant something. Then, one evening, during one of those long walks that teenagers mistake for freedom, she told him about a night she wished she could forget. It had happened months earlier before she met him. There was a boy named Clive Olive. She had gone with him to his house, thinking they were only going to listen to records. His mother had been away. There was beer, awkward laughter, and then something she could not stop. When it was over, she had walked home in silence and told no one. She told Brian everything because she trusted him, because she thought confession might lighten the shame. Instead, it ignited something else entirely. He grew still, she said, his hand tightening around hers until she pulled away. At first, he promised to forget it, but over the weeks that followed, his tenderness curdled into obsession. He spoke of revenge, of teaching the boy a lesson. Jane begged him to let it go, but each time she refused his talk, he grew angrier. "I knew he was planning something," she whispered to Marshall now. "He said he'd get him one day, that he wouldn't stop thinking about it until he did." When Clive disappeared, she didn't ask questions. Some part of her knew, but she buried it. At 16, guilt and fear wear the same face. When the news broke about the body in the harbor, she couldn't sleep. She burned the clothes she had worn that night months ago, as if by erasing the memory she could undo the connection. "Brian said we should," she added quietly. "He said it was the only way to move on." Marshall wrote each word in his notebook, his pen slow and deliberate. He had learned not to rush victims. Truth emerged in fragments, like shells brought ashore by a reluctant tide. When she finished, he closed the book and thanked her. She nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Her story was both revelation and tragedy, the catalyst for violence disguised as love. After she left, he sat for a long time in the stillness of the interview room. Outside, the corridor hummed with typewriters and muted voices, but inside, the air seemed frozen around her words. He had encountered every kind of motive: money, jealousy, impulse, but this one carried a different weight. It was not only revenge for a perceived wrong, it was the desperate logic of a man who needed purpose in a purposeless life. Brian Moore had taken Jane's pain and reshaped it into a performance of justice. It was easier to act the avenger than to confront his own emptiness, and in that performance, others had followed. Albert, Christine, each drawn into the orbit of his rage, each finding in violence a temporary sense of belonging. In the days that followed, Marshall pieced together the chain of events. Around the end of February, Moore began talking openly of sorting the bastard. He told friends that Clive had bragged about Jane, that he had no right to walk around free. He borrowed rope and concrete blocks from a building site where he occasionally worked. Albert supplied the van. Christine packed the blue plastic bags, the same kind used for cement. They rehearsed their vengeance as if it were a task, not a crime. At trial, the press would later turn Jane into a symbol, the innocent spark that lit the inferno. But Marshall refused to see her that way. She was a child trapped in the web of adults who had confused domination with morality. Her confession had not condemned Clive. It had merely given shape to the fury already growing in the man she loved. The detective visited her once more, days before the hearing. She was calmer then, though her eyes carried that hollow look he had seen before in victims who survived the violence of others. "I wish I'd never said anything," she murmured. "Maybe he'd still be alive." Marshall did not correct her. Truth, he knew, was rarely comfort. He told her she had done the right thing now, and she smiled faintly, as if accepting a kindness she didn't believe. In his private notes, he wrote only one line about her: "The living often carry the dead longer than the guilty do." Meanwhile, the town's appetite for the story had become insatiable. Reporters swarmed the courthouse hunting for photographs of Jane leaving her house, of Pauline Olive clutching her handbag under a black umbrella. The narrative had already hardened. The avenging lover, the treacherous youth, the barbaric gang. It was easier to consume tragedy when it came with archetypes. The complexity, the poverty, the trauma, the long history of cruelty that shaped the killers was stripped away in favor of headlines. Marshall avoided the newspapers. He had no interest in myth. He spent his nights reviewing transcripts instead, his pen moving through the tangle of human frailty with mechanical patience. Yet even he could not escape the echo of Jane's story. It gnawed at him, the knowledge that the same need for love that had destroyed Clive now held the girl in invisible chains. On the morning of the trial, he saw her sitting outside the courtroom, pale beneath her wool coat. She looked smaller than he remembered, her hands clasped around a handkerchief. As she entered the witness box, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke without embellishment, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the floor. She told them what she had told him, how she had loved Brian, how she had trusted him, and how that trust had turned to horror. When she finished, Brian Moore laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I don't feel I've done anything wrong," he told the court later. "He raped my girl. I did what needed doing." His words hung in the air like smoke. The gallery murmured. The judge struck his gavel for order. Marshall watched as the young woman flinched, but did not look away. Outside, after her testimony, she stepped into the gray afternoon, reporters shouting her name. She kept walking, head down, through the rain that blurred the street into streaks of silver. The detective watched from a distance until she disappeared around the corner. He felt the weight of history pressing on the moment, how violence, once loosed, consumed everyone it touched, the victim, the killer, the witness, even those who merely listened. That night, the city seemed unusually quiet. The wind off the channel had stilled, and the sea lay flat beneath a pale moon. In that stillness, Marshall found himself thinking not of Brian Moore's fury, but of Jane Anson's silence, the small, shaking hands folded on the table, the whisper of a confession that had unleashed more than she could ever understand. It was a silence that would outlive the trial, as all such silences do. The final evening of February 1973 began without consequence. The air over Hove was heavy and cold, carrying the smell of salt and the dull clang of the harbor cranes. For most people, it was an ordinary Thursday, the kind of night when lights flickered behind curtains and pubs hummed with quiet laughter. But somewhere beyond the edges of the ordinary, a plan was taking shape. 3 young lives, Brian Moore, Albert Dawn, and Christine Butch Dawn, were preparing to end another. It was Brian's idea. He had been talking about it for days, pacing through the Dawn's small rented house, his voice rising and falling like a tide. He told Albert that the boy needed to pay, that Clive Olive had done something unforgivable. He said it with the moral certainty of a man who believed himself righteous. By then, the notion of justice had twisted into something else, a theater of retribution staged for an audience of one. Christine watched him talk, her hands resting on her stomach, her face unreadable. She didn't question him. None of them did. They gathered what they needed with the precision of people acting out a ritual rather than a crime. Rope, taken from a construction site. Plastic bags for the blocks of concrete tied tight with string. A truncheon, once part of Brian's old security job, its handle wrapped in electrical tape. Albert fetched the van from the alley behind the house, checking the fuel though they weren't going far. No one spoke of the body that would soon lie inside it. They didn't have to. The silence was a kind of consent. At 8:30, Brian told Albert to drive. Christine climbed into the back, the van door slamming shut behind her. The engine coughed twice before catching. Its sound filled the narrow street as they rolled toward the coast. Somewhere behind them, the Dawn's dog barked at the noise, then fell silent again. Clive was easy to find. He had been at the Gondola Cafe that evening, sitting by the jukebox talking to a friend. Witnesses would later say he seemed distracted, as though waiting for someone. When the black van stopped outside, he didn't hesitate. He knew them, trusted them even. Maybe he thought the tension between their gangs had cooled. Maybe he wanted to believe in reconciliation. When Brian waved him over, he went willingly. The van door closed behind him, shutting out the hum of the cafe and the faint sound of Hendrix on the jukebox. The streetlight outside flickered, throwing shadows across the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and damp fabric. The engine's vibration filled the silence. Brian turned to him, his expression calm. "We just want to talk," he said. Clive nodded. The van rolled on. Marshall, reconstructing the timeline later, imagined the slow tightening of fear in that confined space. The conversation would have started casually. Questions about the Cougars, about why he'd turned on the Mad Dogs, then the mention of Jane Anson, soft at first, then harder. Accusations layered over memory until they became indistinguishable from fact. "You hurt her," Brian said. "You think you can walk around like nothing happened?" Clive denied it, or tried to. The words tangled in his throat. Maybe he saw the truncheon too late. The first blow came with the wet sound of impact. He cried out, pressing his hands to his head. Another blow followed. Blood spattered the inside of the van. Christine flinched but didn't speak. Albert stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the wheel. "Stop!" someone said. "He's had enough." But Brian didn't stop. When silence returned, it was absolute. The van's headlights swept over the darkened streets as it turned toward the basin. Brian sat breathing heavily, his face expressionless. "He's done," he said. "Get the rope." Albert hesitated, but Brian's voice left no room for refusal. Together they bound the boy's wrists and ankles, wrapping the rope twice, 3 times, knotting it tight. The concrete blocks, cold and damp, were tied with the plastic bags to keep them from scattering. They worked efficiently, like men finishing a job they hadn't chosen but couldn't leave undone. Christine sat in the back, her hands shaking. Later, she would tell police that she prayed silently, though she couldn't remember to whom. She said she wanted to leave, but fear kept her still. She had seen what Brian's anger could do. Her silence was survival. When they reached Aldrington Basin, the tide was high. The lights of the harbor shimmered in the oily water, and a Dutch cargo ship was moored nearby, its crew oblivious. Albert reversed the van close to the edge. The smell of salt and diesel filled the air. Together, the men lifted the body, still warm though none of them noticed, and dragged it toward the railing. The plastic bags rustled as they moved. Brian paused for a moment, looking down at the face that had once been familiar. "He's gone," he said, more to himself than to the others. Then he nodded and they let go. The splash was loud in the stillness. The water closed over quickly, ripples widening, then fading. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then bubbles rose, slow, uneven, like breathing. Albert stared at them, transfixed. What got Albert, he would later tell the court, was the bubbles. What got me was the eyes. They drove away in silence. The van smelled of blood and damp metal. Brian told Albert to pull over near a rubbish tip. They ripped out the carpet and threw it into the heap of waste, covering it with debris. Later, they painted the interior white, the brush strokes uneven but thorough. It was an attempt at cleansing, but the smell lingered. Back at the house, Christine went straight to bed. She lay awake for hours, one hand over her belly, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Albert sat in the kitchen, smoking. Brian paced the room, muttering to himself, rehearsing justification. He had it coming, he said. He asked for it. The words hung in the air, fragile and absurd. In the morning, the town was unchanged. The buses ran, the fishermen hauled their nets, the cafes opened. Only the sea knew what had been given to it. For 6 weeks, it kept its secret. When the body surfaced in April, it was the ship's propeller that disturbed the silence, dragging the boy back from his brief anonymity. By then, the trio had resumed their lives. Brian boasted of his act to those who would listen, dressing murder in the language of justice. Christine grew heavier with pregnancy, her guilt turning inward. Albert worked odd jobs, avoiding eye contact with anyone who asked about the van. They believed the past had sunk for good, but the sea, like memory, rarely forgives. When Marshall later stood at the basin, tracing their steps, he felt the peculiar stillness of a place that had borne witness and said nothing. The crime itself had been brief, 10 minutes of chaos in a world already collapsing, but its echo stretched far beyond the water's edge. It was, he realized, less about vengeance than about identity. People so desperate to feel powerful that they mistook cruelty for meaning. He looked out over the harbor, the gulls circling low, the air heavy with salt. Somewhere below, traces of rope and silt still clung to the basin floor. The tide moved with its slow, indifferent rhythm, carrying fragments of memory out to sea. The trap had been simple. The consequences, infinite. By the time the trial opened at Lewis Crown Court in November 1973, the wind had changed. The long summer had passed, leaving the Sussex coast brittle and gray, its skies streaked with rain. The basin was quiet again, the ships moving in slow procession as if nothing of consequence had ever happened there. But in the courtroom, the ghosts of that night gathered. Clive Olive, 16 years old, his name now the center of an argument between law and conscience. His killers, stripped of myth and reduced to defendants, and a nation that watched itself reflected in their faces. The building itself seemed to absorb the tension. Lewis Crown Court was one of those heavy English structures designed for solemnity, its walls built to withstand time and guilt alike. On the morning of November 26th, the corridor outside the courtroom was filled with reporters clutching notebooks, their breath fogging in the cold. The case had already been branded by the tabloids as the Seaside slaying, another lurid entry in Britain's growing archive of moral decay. But inside, Marshall knew, the story was smaller, sadder, more human. He took his seat near the front as the defendants were brought in. Brian Moore entered first, wearing a bus conductor's jacket, his hair tied back. His gait was relaxed, almost theatrical, as though the dock were another stage. Behind him came Albert Dawn, short, tense, his tattooed hands clasped together. And then Christine, her belly no longer swollen, her body thin from confinement. Her child had been born in Holloway Prison, a boy she had barely been allowed to hold. She looked neither defiant nor afraid, only emptied. The charges were read: murder for Moore and Dawn, manslaughter for Christine. Their pleas, not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility, hung in the air. It was a phrase meant to split culpability from intention, as if reason could be measured like blood or fingerprints. The prosecution opened with the evidence the sea had refused to keep: photographs of the basin, the blue rope, the concrete blocks, the fragments of algae found in Clive's lungs. Marshall had seen them countless times, but in the courtroom their reality felt heavier. The photographs of the boy's body were not shown publicly, only described, yet the words were enough to still the room. Even the reporters stopped writing. Then came the testimony. One by one, the witnesses recounted their pieces of the story. The dock worker who saw the van, the cafe owner who remembered Clive's last evening, Julie Harmon with her bracelet, her eyes fixed on the floor. Each fragment was small, but together they formed a mosaic of inevitability. When Jane Anson took the stand, the courtroom fell into a hush. She looked almost translucent beneath the overhead lights, her hands folded in her lap. She spoke of her relationship with Brian Moore, of her confession, of how his kindness had turned into rage. Her voice faltered only once, when she said Clive's name. Brian stared at her throughout, his face impassive except for the faint twitch of a smile. When she finished, he leaned toward his lawyer and muttered something that made the man flinch. The defense painted a picture of damaged youth, of lives twisted by poverty and neglect. Their argument was simple. These were not hardened killers, but products of broken homes, of a society that had failed to teach them anything but violence. The psychiatrist spoke of impulsive rage, of substance abuse, of emotional immaturity. He described Brian as a man trapped in the mythology of rebellion, unable to separate self-pity from righteousness. Marshall listened, not disagreeing. He knew it was true, at least partly. The system had produced them, raised them, and abandoned them, yet acknowledging that truth did not absolve them. Pity was not the same as forgiveness. The most chilling moment came when Brian Moore took the stand in his own defense. He spoke confidently, his voice measured, almost persuasive. He admitted to striking Clive but denied intending to kill him. "I knew it was against the law," he said, "but what he'd done was worse. He raped my girl. I only did what had to be done." The prosecutor pressed him. Did he think that made him the judge of life and death? Brian smirked. "Someone had to be," he said. The judge's face did not move, but the tension in the room thickened like fog. Then, as if to punctuate his performance, Brian turned toward the jury and raised his voice. "I've done Brighton a favor," he said. "That scum won't hurt anyone again." When the prosecutor tried to continue, Brian exploded. "You shut your mouth, or I'll belt you one, mate," he shouted, lunging forward. His hands hit the rail of the dock. The guards grabbed him before he could move further. The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps, murmurs, the clatter of reporters' pens. Christine screamed his name, then began sobbing. It took several minutes to restore order. For Marshall, it was the final proof of what he already knew. Beneath the arrogance, Brian Moore was terrified. Violence had been his only language, and now, stripped of it, he was lost. The trial lasted 9 days. On the final morning, rain lashed against the courthouse windows, streaking the glass like veins. The jury filed in, faces pale from sleepless nights. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and spoke the words that turned the story from speculation into history. Brian Moore, guilty of murder. Albert Dawn, guilty of murder. Christine Dawn, guilty of manslaughter. There was a moment of silence, then the shuffle of movement as the judge rose. His words were measured, weary. "Your acts," he said, "were not of men, but of children who mistook cruelty for courage. The court must impose the only penalty the law allows." Moore and Dawn were sentenced to life imprisonment. Christine received 10 years. When the sentences were read, she fainted, collapsing into the arms of a matron. Moore stood unmoving. Albert wept quietly, his shoulders shaking. As they were led away, the sound of their footsteps echoed through the stone corridor. Reporters rushed to the telephones outside, their voices sharp with excitement. Within hours, the headlines appeared: "Hell's Angels Slayers Jailed for Life." The country, hungry for narrative, found comfort in condemnation. Marshall left the courtroom after the crowd dispersed. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet stone and seaweed. He walked alone down the steps, his coat collar turned up against the chill. Behind him, the courthouse loomed, a monument to order, to the illusion that justice could mend what life had broken. He did not feel triumph. Cases like this never ended. They simply receded, becoming part of the collective unease that settled over the nation during those years. He thought of Pauline Olive, of the candle she had once lit in her window, and wondered whether she had extinguished it or let it burn down to nothing. Later that evening, as he sat at his desk completing the final report, he paused over one line. "The investigation has concluded successfully." He crossed out the word "successfully." He wrote instead, "The investigation has ended." Outside his window, the lights of Hove flickered like small, uncertain stars. The sea was invisible in the darkness, but he could hear it, an endless, restless movement, erasing footprints, swallowing voices, reminding the living that justice, too, was only temporary. In the stillness of that moment, Marshall realized that what had been tried in the courtroom was not just 3 lives, but an era, the last breath of a country that still wanted to believe in moral clarity. The verdict had been rendered, the law satisfied, but beneath it all, the deeper rot remained. He closed his notebook, the ink still wet, and sat for a long time listening to the sea. Somewhere out there, under the same gray sky, another story was already beginning. When the courtroom emptied and the press turned its attention elsewhere, silence reclaimed Hove. It began in small ways: fewer whispers in the cafes, fewer questions from neighbors, the newspapers replaced by newer scandals. But for those who had lived within the orbit of the case, silence was not peace. It was merely the sound that grief makes when it has nowhere left to go. For Pauline Olive, life after the trial became a ritual of endurance. Her son's death had been transformed into spectacle, his name repeated, dissected, printed, but the aftermath belonged only to her. Each morning she still woke before dawn, not because there was work to go to, but because she could not sleep past the hour when he used to leave for his shifts at the Gondola Cafe. She made tea for two, as she had during those first weeks of his disappearance, and poured the second cup down the sink. Some habits survive even the truth. People stopped visiting after a while. Pity, she learned, had an expiration date. Neighbors crossed the street rather than reopen wounds they couldn't heal. The few who did speak offered phrases worn smooth by repetition. Time heals. At least they were caught. He's in a better place. She nodded politely, knowing they were trying to console themselves as much as her. She had moved her son's things into boxes: his comics, his records, the bracelet he had once given to Julie. But she couldn't bring herself to throw them away. They sat stacked in the corner of his bedroom, like a small shrine to unfinished life. Sometimes she would sit on the edge of his bed, holding one of his notebooks, tracing the uneven handwriting. She didn't cry anymore. Grief had become part of her breathing, quieter but constant. The authorities sent letters about compensation, forms filled with sterile phrases, for loss of earnings, for emotional distress. She filled none of them. Money, she thought, was useless to the dead. She kept only one letter, the coroner's certificate. It was folded neatly, placed in an envelope, and hidden behind a photograph of Clive as a boy holding a kitten. Outside her house, the world went on. The early 70s gave way to strikes, inflation, and the brittle optimism of new governments. In Brighton, the youth gangs dispersed, their members growing older, poorer, or simply tired. The mad dogs faded from the streets like a story people stopped believing. Those who had worn the patch traded their jackets for overalls or unemployment lines. A few ended up in prison for unrelated crimes. Others disappeared altogether, moving north or vanishing into London's anonymity. The Gondola Cafe survived for a few years more, but it was no longer the place it had been. The jukebox still worked, though fewer coins dropped into it. The laughter that once filled the evenings gave way to quieter conversations. Eventually, in 1978, it closed its doors for good. By then, the murder had already become local folklore, a cautionary tale told by parents to restless sons. Brian Moore remained in prison. His first years inside were marked by defiance. He wrote letters to the press describing himself as a misunderstood man and spoke of appealing his conviction. But prison is a mirror that never forgives. The bravado eroded, the letters stopped. Those who saw him years later said his hair had turned gray before its time, his arrogance drained to fatigue. He applied for parole in the late 80s and was denied. The record did not show what became of him after that. Albert Dawn served 15 years. When he was released, he returned to Sussex, working briefly as a handyman before moving inland. No one knew whether he felt remorse. When a journalist tracked him down in the 90s, he refused to speak of the past. "That was another life," he said, and closed the door. Christine, Butch, was released earlier than either man. The appeal court reduced her sentence, recognizing her limited role in the murder. She emerged in 1974 with a child she barely knew and a name that had become a curse. For a while, she tried to rebuild her life. She found work cleaning offices, then lost it. She was arrested twice in later years for petty theft and once for public disorder. The newspapers didn't mention her after that. Some said she drifted to London, others that she remarried and changed her name. Marshall never found out. As for Detective Chief Superintendent James Marshall, the case remained with him long after it was closed. He continued in service for another decade, solving other crimes, earning quiet commendations. Yet he knew this one had changed him. It wasn't the brutality, he'd seen worse, but the ordinariness of it. The way violence had emerged not from madness but from vacancy, from a void where meaning should have been. In the evenings, he often walked by the harbor. The basin had been dredged and cleaned since the discovery, its water less murky now, the surrounding docks busier, but the place still held the same peculiar stillness. He would lean on the railing, watching the reflections tremble in the water, remembering the boy who had surfaced there. He didn't think of the killers often. He thought of the silence between them all, the kind that fills a van or a house or a life. Once he saw Pauline there, standing alone by the railing. She didn't notice him. She was looking out at the water, her hands clasped in front of her. He didn't approach her. There was nothing left to say. He watched her turn and walk away, her figure small against the wide expanse of sea. In time, the story of Clive Olive became history. Students of criminology would later read about it in old case files, noting the sociological themes: working-class alienation, youth culture, the collapse of post-war optimism. To them, it was an example, a cautionary narrative neatly bounded by dates and verdicts. But to those who lived it, it never shrank into simplicity. It lingered, as real tragedies do, in the quiet corners of memory. By the late 1980s, Brighton had changed again. The waterfront cafes were trendy, the old youth clubs demolished or replaced by boutiques. The Hells Angels mythology had been replaced by punk, then by something else. But beneath the new paint, the same undercurrent remained, a loneliness dressed as rebellion, a hunger for belonging that never quite found its home. One rainy afternoon, an old constable who had worked under Marshall visited the station archives. He found the original case file, its edges yellowed. Inside were photographs: the harbor, the rope, the bracelet with Ollie and Julie. He stared at them for a long time before closing the folder. On its cover, in faded ink, was a single line written in Marshall's hand. He was just a boy. Years later, after Marshall's retirement, the detective's necktie from the case was found among his belongings, a dark blue fabric patterned with tiny gondolas, designed to commemorate the murder squad's work. It was a symbol of closure, but it looked more like mourning. In Hove, the house where Pauline had lived was eventually sold. The new owners never knew who had slept in the small bedroom overlooking the street. The sea was still only 2 miles away, though it could no longer be heard over the traffic. The candle she had once kept in the window was gone, but sometimes, when the sun set low and the glass caught the light, it seemed as though something still flickered there. Every town holds one story it cannot forget, even when it pretends to. For Brighton, this was that story, a reminder that the line between ordinary life and darkness is thinner than anyone likes to believe. Time moved on, the faces changed, but the basin remained, patient and unjudging, its water carrying the same eternal rhythm, washing away, revealing again. And somewhere in that rhythm, the memory of a boy named Clive Olive drifted, neither saint nor sinner, just human, like the country that had made him and the sea that had taken him back. Years later, when James Marshall thought of the case, it no longer came to him as a sequence of facts. It returned in fragments: shadows against the water, the creak of a rope, the thin tremor in a mother's voice. The neatness of his reports, the precision of his evidence logs, had faded into something more abstract, a meditation on what violence really meant in a country that had quietly forgotten how to take care of its own. He was retired by then, living in a small bungalow outside Worthing, his world reduced to the sea, the weather, and the slow rhythm of days. The police pension kept him comfortable, though comfort was not something he trusted. It made people complacent, soften the edges of memory. Most mornings he walked the same route along the promenade, his steps measured, his back slightly bent. He carried a walking stick now, but he rarely needed it. Habit was harder to let go of than pain. Sometimes, when the wind was calm, he would stop and watch the tide come in. It had the same sound it always had, steady, unjudging. He thought of Aldrington Basin, often not as a crime scene but as a place that had absorbed too much. The fishermen still came and went, their boats tracing the same path across the channel, as if unaware that the water beneath them held the residue of something unresolved. He wondered if they ever felt it, the faint, invisible weight of history below their nets. He had tried, once, to write about it, a memoir of sorts. The publishers liked the idea, true crime from a detective's desk. But when he sat down to begin, the words resisted him. He could list the evidence, recount the trial, describe the interviews, but what lingered was not the case itself. It was the silence after. The silence in Pauline Olive's kitchen when she realized her son was gone. The silence in the courtroom when the jury pronounced its verdict. The silence that followed every act of violence when language failed and the world continued anyway. So he abandoned the book. The file remained on his desk, unopened, a relic of something he no longer wanted to analyze. Sometimes former colleagues visited, usually unannounced. They would bring wine or newspapers, still eager to talk about the old days. They called the Olive case one of the classics, the kind that made reputations. He would smile politely, then change the subject. They didn't understand that what looked like accomplishment from the outside felt, to him, like failure. Solving a crime was supposed to restore balance, but after that trial, balance felt like a superstition. He had spent his career in pursuit of answers, but the older he grew, the more he understood that most questions had no resolution, only endings. The country had changed again by the time he reached his 70s. Thatcher's England had replaced the austerity of his youth with something colder. The children of the 1970s had grown into adults burdened by cynicism. The optimism of progress had eroded into competition. Violence had changed shape. It was less visible, less theatrical, but no less cruel. He saw it in headlines about neglect, homelessness, addiction. It was the same despair, dressed in different clothes. He thought of Clive Olive as part of that lineage, one life among thousands, shaped by the same quiet decay. What haunted him was not the murder itself, but how predictable it had been. Every piece of it, the poverty, the bravado, the gang rituals, the violence against women, had been there long before the first blow was struck. It had all been rehearsed by history. Once he received a letter from a criminology student who was writing a dissertation on the moral geography of 1970s youth violence. She wanted to know whether he thought the Olive case represented a breakdown of law or of culture. He never replied. To answer would have meant pretending the two could be separated. In the evenings, when sleep eluded him, he sometimes walked to the end of his street and sat on a bench overlooking the water. The sea was darker here than in Brighton, deeper, its surface broken only by the glint of passing lights. He liked to think of it as an old witness, ancient, impartial, capable of keeping secrets longer than any court record. He often thought of Pauline, too. He had seen her once more, years after the trial. It was a chance encounter outside a grocer's in Chichester. She had aged suddenly, her face drawn, her hair the color of ash. She recognized him immediately. They spoke for a few minutes, exchanging the polite phrases of strangers. She said she still dreamed of her son, sometimes as a boy, sometimes as he'd been before he disappeared. "He always looks happy in the dreams," she said. He nodded, unable to reply. When she left, he stood for a long time on the pavement, watching her walk away into the crowd. He learned of her death later through a former colleague. She had passed quietly with no surviving family. The funeral was small. A few neighbors attended. There was no mention of her son in the obituary. The past, he thought, has a way of erasing itself politely. In the archives, the case file still existed, locked in a cabinet marked Historic Homicides. He sometimes wondered who would read it next. A new detective, perhaps, young and eager, tracing through the documents in search of lessons. But what lesson was there to find? That violence often begins long before it's visible. That justice, once achieved, rarely heals. That some wounds are inherited rather than inflicted. He had once believed that his job was to protect order, to draw a line between right and wrong, to stand where the world blurred. But age had taught him that order was never fixed. It was negotiated daily between the powerful and the forgotten. And those who fell outside its boundaries, like Clive, like the Dawns, like Pauline, were not exceptions. They were its casualties. One evening, near dusk, he walked again to the harbor. The air smelled of rain and diesel, and the gulls wheeled low over the basin. A fishing boat was coming in, its lights trembling on the water. He stood at the railing, the same place where Clive's body had been pulled ashore decades earlier. Time had changed the landscape. The cranes were newer, the water cleaner. But the feeling was the same, a stillness that bordered on accusation. He took off his hat and held it against his chest, a small gesture of respect or apology. He wasn't sure which. For a moment, he imagined the boy's face as it had once been, unmarked by fear or defiance, just young and alive. Then the image dissolved, as all memories eventually do, leaving only the sound of the tide against the dock. He turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back once more. The basin stretched out before him, wide and indifferent, the sky dimming above it. Somewhere in that vastness, he thought, all stories end the same way. Washed clean, unnamed, returned to the silence from which they came. And as he walked away, his footsteps fading into the wind, he knew that what haunted him was not the crime, nor the killers, nor even the boy who had died. It was the realization that England itself, the country he had served and believed in, was full of quiet basins just like this one. Places where lost lives settled unseen, waiting for someone, someday, to disturb the water again. Stories do not die with their subjects. They change shape, losing flesh, gaining legend, echoing in the gaps between truth and imagination. Years after the trial, when Brighton's neon signs grew brighter and its streets cleaner, the name Clive Olive began to fade from police ledgers, but found another, quieter existence in the conversations of locals. The story became something retold at a distance, part cautionary tale, part ghost story. What had once been horror softened into folklore, the edges smoothed by time. By the 1980s, few people remembered the facts clearly. They remembered the feeling instead, the shock of the body in the harbor, the uneasy sense that evil could be homemade. Newcomers heard fragments in pubs along the seafront. A boy tied with concrete blocks, a biker gang that wasn't really bikers, a van that drove into the night. Each retelling bent toward the speaker's need. Some made Clive a martyr of youth rebellion, others a reckless delinquent who got mixed up with the wrong lot. Memory, like the tide, was impartial. It reshaped what it touched. In some versions, the murder had happened in daylight. In others, the killers had vanished, never caught. The details were unreliable, but the atmosphere endured. A melancholy sense that the town itself had absorbed the crime into its marrow. Even those who knew nothing of the case felt it in the architecture, in the way the sea mist clung to the alleyways after dark. The story was less about the boy than about the idea that a place could carry guilt. There were older residents who refused to speak of it at all. They said the past was best left where it belonged. But silence, Marshall had once observed, is a form of storytelling too. It keeps the outline but erases the color. By keeping quiet, they allowed others to fill in the blanks. A small article appeared in a local history magazine around 1985, titled "The Murder in the Basin." It was written by a journalist who had grown up in Hove and remembered hearing her parents talk about it when she was a child. Her piece was careful, respectful, but softened by nostalgia. She described the early 70s as a time of restless youth and misunderstood rebellion. The murder, she argued, was a symptom of the decade's confusion, a collision between fading post-war hope and the hunger for identity. It was an essay meant to comfort more than disturb, to fit tragedy into a historical pattern that could be understood, even forgiven. Readers wrote letters in response. Some thanked her for remembering. Others accused her of romanticizing a killer. One anonymous note, written in blue ink, said only, "You don't know what that boy was like. None of you do." Perhaps it was a neighbor, or someone who had known Clive when he was alive. Perhaps it was Pauline, though she had already passed by then. No one could tell. The old cafes where the gangs had once gathered were gone. The gondola had become a restaurant called El Gaucho, its walls painted red and gold, its jukebox replaced by background music played from hidden speakers. Couples dined where teenagers had once argued over coffee. The owner, a man from Buenos Aires, knew nothing of the place's history until a customer told him. He listened politely, then nodded, as if hearing folklore from another continent. To him, it was just a story, harmless in its distance. Only the harbor remained unchanged. The water was clearer now, the docks refurbished, but its quiet was the same. Fishermen mended nets where the police had once erected canvas screens. The ripples still carried a peculiar rhythm, as if remembering. Locals said the basin was haunted, though no one could agree by whom. Some said the boy, others his killers, others the city itself. Each generation gives its ghosts the faces it needs. In a pub near the station, older men told the story to younger ones. They exaggerated the violence, turned the characters into archetypes, the angel-faced boy, the red-haired devil, the pregnant witch. They laughed as they told it, not out of cruelty but as a way to distance themselves from the unease it stirred. The younger listeners nodded, pretending disbelief while filing away the details. The story had become entertainment, an unsettling inheritance dressed as a lesson. Marshall, long retired, heard one such retelling once by accident. He had gone into the pub on a rainy afternoon for a pint, and at the next table 2 men were talking about the biker murder back in the day. One said he remembered seeing the van. The other claimed to have known the copper who solved it. Their voices carried the casual certainty of those who have nothing at stake. They got most of it wrong. Dates, motives, even names. But their tone was affectionate, as though they were speaking of an urban legend rather than a human life. Marshall didn't correct them. He simply finished his drink and left. Outside, the rain had eased, and the sound of the sea was faint but steady. He realized, not without a certain sadness, that the case had completed its final transformation. It had become a story people told when they needed to remind themselves that they lived in a safer, saner time. But stories have a way of enduring where justice fades. Every so often, a journalist or a student would dig into the archives, chasing the shape of the truth. They always began with the same question: what really happened to the boy in the basin? And always ended in the same place, an incomplete understanding. The documents told them what, but never why. The photographs were too static, the transcripts too rational. They could record facts, but not the loneliness that had driven them. One article published in 1993 tried to connect the Olive murder to the broader moral landscape of post-war Britain. The author argued that the crime represented the corrosion of working-class identity under economic decline. The piece was academic, filled with terms like marginalization and cultural dislocation. It was not wrong, but it was incomplete. The truth, Marshall thought when he read it, was smaller and crueler. It wasn't politics that had killed the boy, but the failure of love. By the 2000s, only traces of the story remained in local memory. It surfaced occasionally in online forums where amateur historians compared notes on unsolved or forgotten crimes. Users shared scanned newspaper clippings, speculated about what had happened to the killers, wondered whether the victim's family had ever found peace. Some treated it like a puzzle, others like poetry. In the endless circulation of digital rumor, the facts drifted further from shore. And yet the basin remained. The tide still came in and went out, a clock indifferent to the names written in its margins. Sometimes at night, when the wind blew from the west, people living nearby claimed they could hear a faint rhythm beneath the water, a knocking, irregular and soft, like rope against metal. It was only the sound of boats, of course, but imagination thrives on coincidence. If you walked there at dusk, when the light thinned and the gulls quieted, you might feel it too. The strange weight of something remembered but not understood. You might stop and look down at the surface of the water, seeing your reflection tremble in the dark. For a moment, you would not know whose face it was. That is how stories endure. Not as history, but as atmosphere. The basin no longer held a body, but it held the residue of what had happened there. The sorrow, the pity, the bewilderment. The city built itself anew, but beneath the fresh paint and renovated docks, the old grief lingered, quiet and patient. Marshall, in his last years, found comfort in that. Perhaps, he thought, it was the best any of us could hope for, not to be remembered clearly, but to leave behind a trace in the world's texture, a faint change in its weather, to exist, if only as a disturbance on the water's surface, long after the ripples have faded. In the end, even stories about death return to the quiet rhythm of ordinary time. By the early 1990s, the world that had once surrounded the Olive case no longer existed. The docks were renovated, the youth clubs replaced by supermarkets, and the blackened brick terraces of Hove scrubbed into pastel rose for commuters. It was a New England, tidier, richer, and more forgetful. Yet for those who had lived through that first spring of 1973, when the water at Aldrington Basin gave up its secret, the memory remained, unspoken, like an ache that changes but never leaves. James Marshall lived long enough to see the century turn. His hair thinned, his walk slowed, and his handwriting, once so exact, became hesitant. He still rose early out of habit, reading the newspaper with a detective's eye for what the headlines left unsaid. Crime, he noticed, had changed shape. It had grown quieter, more bureaucratic, more hidden behind closed doors. But the psychology of it, the desperation, the loneliness, remained the same. Sometimes he received letters from journalists or students who had come across the Olive case in old archives. They wanted quotes, reflections, a summary of what it meant. He rarely replied. The young were eager to make sense of it all, to find symbols and lessons where he had only found human frailty. He didn't resent them for it. The urge to impose order was an instinct as old as grief, but experience had taught him that the truth of a crime was never in its motive or method. It lay in the long silence that followed, the space between memory and forgetting. He spent his last years near Shoreham, not far from the sea. The bungalow faced west, so that each evening the sun fell directly into his living room, gilding the photographs that lined the mantelpiece. His wife, long gone, his children, scattered, a small black and white portrait of his younger self in uniform. There were no reminders of his career. The framed commendations and medals were packed away in boxes, stored beneath the stairs. He kept one thing only, a thin file, its cover worn soft, containing the photographs from 1973. The basin, the rope, the jacket, the boy's bracelet. On quiet nights, he would open it. Not out of morbid fascination, but out of obligation. It was his way of keeping faith with what had been lost. Each time he found new details, the faint reflection of a policeman's boot in the water, a cigarette butt near the quay, the way the floodlights had turned the basin's surface to silver. None of it changed the story, but all of it deepened it. Memory, he had learned, was not about accuracy. It was about persistence. In the summer of 1997, he fell ill. The doctors called it a slow failure, a polite term for the body's gradual retreat. He didn't fight it. His daughter visited each weekend, bringing groceries and books he rarely opened. She said he seemed peaceful, though she didn't understand why. What she couldn't see was that he was already half absorbed into reflection, measuring the distance between his life and the lives he had witnessed unravel. One evening, after she had gone, he sat by the window watching the last light drain from the sky. The air smelled faintly of salt. Far off, beyond the rooftops, he could just make out the glint of the harbor cranes. He thought of Clive Olive again, not as a case, but as a boy walking home, tired, unaware of the story waiting for him. He thought of Pauline, of her small house and her unyielding grief. He thought of Brian Moore and Albert Dawn, who had built a morality from anger because they had been given nothing else. He realized then that what united them all, victim, killer, mother, detective, was not guilt or innocence, but loneliness. Every act, every mistake had grown out of the same emptiness that haunted the decade. Britain in the 70s had been a place adrift between promises, the old order decaying, the new not yet born. Young men sought power where they could find it, in fists, in gangs, in the illusion of control. The institutions meant to protect them, schools, churches, the law itself, were already hollow. The murder at Aldrington Basin was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. He had spent his career believing in systems, in the slow machinery of justice, but as he watched the dusk settle, he saw it differently. Justice was not something achieved once and for all. It was something tended to, like a garden or a conscience, and always at risk of neglect. Perhaps that was why he had stayed with the case so long after it ended. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about remembrance. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for a moment the room was filled with amber light. The photographs on the mantelpiece glowed as if lit from within. He reached for the case file, opened it one last time, and placed his hand on the top photograph, the one of the harbor at night, the water still, the floodlights cutting white paths across its surface. He closed his eyes. Outside, the evening deepened. The sea moved with its usual indifference, washing against the walls of the basin, erasing, rewriting. Somewhere beyond sight, a ship's horn echoed, a long, low note that seemed to travel not through air, but through time. The next morning, his daughter found him still in his chair, the file resting on his lap. His expression was calm, almost curious, as though he had just solved a riddle. The photograph beneath his hand was slightly creased, his thumb leaving a faint impression on the water's edge. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of former colleagues and neighbors. A retired sergeant gave the eulogy, speaking of Marshall's dedication to duty and decency. But those who had known him well sensed that his true legacy lay elsewhere, in his refusal to let cruelty become ordinary. After the service, his daughter scattered his ashes near the harbor, at the place where his story had once begun. The tide took them gently, carrying them toward the open sea. In the years that followed, the Olive case slipped further into obscurity. The file was digitized, misfiled, then rediscovered by historians. They wrote papers, documentaries, and essays, each one layering interpretation over memory. To them, it was part of Britain's moral landscape, a reflection of youth, unrest, social failure, changing justice. But for those who stood by the basin on quiet evenings, none of that mattered. The water remained the same. When the wind was still, the harbor lights reflected perfectly on the surface, 2 rows of gold, trembling slightly with each ripple. And if you stood there long enough, listening to the slow rhythm of the tide, you might understand what Marshall had come to believe, that all stories, no matter how tragic, dissolve into the same silence, the same light, the same sea. The boy, the killers, the mother, the detective, all of them had returned to it. carried not by vengeance or justice, but by time. And time, unlike the law, forgives everything.